What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome to my backyard. I'm gonna be building a house, start to finish, from scratch. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this project. With my building permit in hand, I could finally get to work getting the site prepped for building, starting with removing the trees which would interfere with the building. And the SmartFellers crew repeated this process on the rest of the trees, removing roughly a dozen trees in total, and they were done by lunchtime, which was pretty amazing. Now I needed to set up the actual building layout with a string line set to final grade, which in my case was the top of the concrete piers. So first we set up the laser on our fancy job site tripod, aka a paver on top of a stump, and then check the drop from one corner of the building to the other corner at the far end.
At the foot.
Okay.
46 inches.
Man, so a 3-foot drop.
Basically.
Next we can move on to cutting a bunch of stakes for our batter boards. With some stakes cut, we could move on to setting them in place around the corners of the building. Once all of our stakes were set, we could mark our actual grade on each of the stakes, which was 12 inches below our laser line. Next, we could attach the batter boards flush with our marks, and then set each of the batter boards to our final grade so that we could then run our string lines off the top of these batter boards and know they were also at grade. We repeated this process at the other two corners, and then we could set the stakes on the high corner. With the stakes set and the batter board set up, we could get our first string line set, and this was our reference line, again parallel to our main house. Also, Eric showed off his ninja reflexes.
Ooh, look at that. So you can get it really tight and then pull it back, just let go of it.
Oh wow. Finally, we could set the string on the stake to grade, and with that, we finally had one of our string lines set, which only took about 2 hours.
So we got one line there. Thinking it's probably about lunchtime.
Yeah.
We got 10:07.
10:07.
Let's do it.
Time to get a beer?
Yeah.
Go down to burial? With the first line set, things went more quickly, and we could reference all of our other lines off of that first line, and we started by setting the other line parallel to our first line. After pulling the diagonal measurement, we pulled the straight measurement from that diagonal mark to mark the final corner, and then checked our diagonals in both directions, and these numbers were off by about 1/4 of an inch.
This is the perils of burning an inch. So my original mark I didn't burn an inch. I scratched it out, made another mark. We still put it on my original mark. So this is an inch off. Because we were looking and saying, this looks a little wrong. It's only 1/2 inch difference over here, but still.
Double checked it though.
Yeah.
So much better.
After fixing this, our diagonals lined up perfectly, and we ended up with a nice square corner after setting the line at this end of the building.
I mean, I think it looks pretty good. I can't even hold it steady.
Pretty good.
I didn't drink enough coffee.
With that, our layout was officially done with our string line set to grade, which was again at the top of the piers in our case, and next we needed to go ahead and lay out the locations for those piers and footings. My architect, Rick Caseby, had already laid out these footing locations on the building plans, which we do have for sale in case you're interested in building a building similar to this, and I'll link to those in the video description below.
So that'd be your sonotube right there.
And so we knew both the locations and the size of the footings based on these plans.
That ought to do it. That is a monster.
After getting all the footing locations laid out, it was time for the fun part, digging the footings. First, we needed to grade the area near the end of the building with the highest grade, again to increase the distance between the ground and the floor joists, since that distance has to be 18 inches by code. And this was made a lot more difficult by the giant stump right in the middle of the site, which I unfortunately didn't have ground down until later in the process. Anyway, after a lot of digging and running the excavator around to compact the dirt, we pulled out the laser to check my work, and things looked pretty dang good.
26, 26, 25, so you're just...
Wow.
25, 25, wow! Magic!
Pro grader right here, man.
So with that, the grading was done, so we could finally move on to actually digging the footings, which actually went pretty quickly and only took about half a day. First, we remarked the location since the original layout marks had been removed during grading, and then I started digging the footings. And this process went super quick while Eric was on site to help clean up the holes, but unfortunately he had to run after the first row, so I was on my own for the second row. and working by myself definitely slowed things down quite a bit as I had to get in and out of the excavator to check the size of the holes and also clean out any loose dirt. And these footings also ended up having a lot more roots in them because they were closer to where some of the big trees had been removed, and this made it really hard to get good, clean buckets full of dirt. And after a lot of work cutting roots with a reciprocating saw and clearing out the leftover dirt with a shovel, the footings were dug, and the next step in the process was getting the forms created for the footings, as well as adding all of the rebar that was specified in the building plans. Eric and Jamie, the Perkins Builder brothers, were on hand to help with this process, and we started by getting our 10-foot lengths of rebar cut into 2-foot sections using an angle grinder. To keep the rebar pieces securely in place while the concrete was being poured, we needed to tie them together with pieces of wire. After adding the wire, we could drop the rebar into the hole for the footing, setting the rebar up on these plastic rebar chairs, which helped us center the rebar in the base of the footing. To set the sonotubes, we would first measure the rough length of sonotube we needed, and we made sure to leave some extra length so that they could run above the string line so that I could cut them to final height later. Next, we cut the sonotube to length with a circular saw, and these are just cardboard, so they cut really easily. Next, we marked the center of where the sonotube needed to be placed on our string line, and then set our J-bar at that location. We could then mark on the side of the sonotube where it needed to meet up with the 1x4 bracing, and then pre-drive some screws from inside the sonotube to attach it to the 1x4s. Next, we drove in a stake at each end of the 1x4 bracing so that we could more firmly attach the supports to the ground. We screwed the bracing to the stakes, making any adjustments to ensure the sonotubes were level and centered in the holes while doing this, and we could also add extra screws through the bracing into the sonotube to further secure everything if it felt like it needed it. We called it a day at that point, and I got up bright and early the next morning before the sun rose to cut the sonotubes to length. And I first got my line laser set up at grade to the height of the batter boards and string line, and then I could get the sonotubes cutting along that laser line. And getting to work before the sun was up really helped me see my line clearly, and I cut the sonotubes using a cutoff wheel on the angle grinder. I repeated this process on the rest of the sonotubes, and after I had them all cut to height, I double checked my work with a string line which ran across the top edge of the sonotubes pretty much perfectly. Back on site, the pump truck operator could operate the pump with a remote, which allowed him to control the feed rate of the concrete, and he could then start filling the footings. And he first filled the base of the footing, adding concrete until it met up with the bottom edge of the sonotube, and then he partially filled the sonotube. Next, I added a few more pieces of rebar in the sonotube, both to further reinforce the sonotube area, but also to help get rid of any large air pockets in the sonotube. After I added the rebar, the pump truck operator would come back to top up the sonotube, making sure it was slightly overflowing so I could screed it level later. And we repeated this process on the rest of the footings, which only took about 30 minutes. Once the footings were filled, the pump truck guys then needed to pump the remaining concrete out of their lines. Finally, after getting most of the concrete out, the pump truck operator ran a sponge through the line to help clean out any remaining bits of concrete, and this sponge comes out the other end like a rocket. With that, the pump truck guys headed out, and I could get to work screeding the top of the footings to ensure they were flat and level. And I just used a straight piece of wood to do this and made sure to saw the board back and forth to remove any excess concrete. And after all the footings were screeded, I let them cure overnight. The next morning, the concrete was cured enough to remove the forms, and then I could get to work filling in the dirt to cover up the base of the footings, which was made much easier since I still had the excavator rented. I filled in around all the footings, and then since I still had the excavator for the rest of the day, I decided to go ahead and dig the trenches for my power and water lines as well as my sewer line. So building code in this area dictates that the water line has to be dug to a depth of 24 inches, the power lines need to be dug to a depth of 18 inches, and water and power lines have to be at least 12 inches apart. Because of this, I dug my trench to a depth of at least 24 inches with a width of roughly 18 inches, which was the width of the bucket, and this gave me plenty of space for both lines. I ended the trench roughly under where the bathroom and kitchen would be, since I knew most of the water supply would need to be there, and then I could work on the sewer line. Once again, I dug the sewer trench to the bathroom area, basically almost connecting the two trenches, and then I had to return the excavator, unfortunately. Next, we needed to get the 6x6 post base brackets attached to the piers, and these will connect the concrete piers to the wooden girders. To install the brackets, we first marked the hole location for the wedge anchor bolts, which was basically dead center on the piers, and then we could drill the hole with this massive 5/8 of an inch SDS max bit. And before drilling, I marked my hole depth on the bit using some painter's tape. And I was lucky enough to have access to this beast of an SDS drill to drill these holes, and this thing was just comically large.
Yeah, here you go.
Say hello to my little
Let's do a little
friend.
comparison there.
Yeah.
It's a little bigger.
Just
Oh, that was easy.
As you can see, this drill made insanely quick work of drilling these holes, and after drilling the holes to depth, we would then run the drill in and out a few times to remove any compacted dust from the holes. Next, we could pound in the wedge anchor bolts and then snug down the nut to secure the bracket. To set the brackets so they were all in line, we measured off of our string line and set them all to the same distance off of that line. And this measurement didn't need to necessarily be a specific number, since the floor framing overhangs the beams at both ends. We just needed the measurement to be consistent across the brackets so that they were all in line. We repeated this process for the rest of the piers, setting the brackets in line, and then we could get to work building the girders or beams, but first we needed to go buy a whole bunch of lumber.
How much weight did you say this would hold?
We'll find out. Still pretty good.
Yeah?
I think I've got like...
Yeah, you got like an inch of suspension left.
These girders are made from 3 layers of pressure-treated 2x12s, and since our footings were roughly 12 feet apart, we could use 12-foot-long boards for these center sections. So this pressure-treated lumber definitely wasn't perfectly straight, and Eric had another great trick for getting these boards flush with each other. He would first add a temporary nail or screw as a point of leverage, and then pry on that with his hammer, flushing up the top edge of both boards. We could then nail the boards together, which set them in place, and then once they were nailed together, the temporary nail or screw could be removed and we could move on down the board. You can also do this another way by adding a spacer between the two boards, and a speed square is perfect for this, and then drive a screw in at an angle. And the spacer here helps to give the screw more room to pull the high board into place. Anyway, after tacking the boards together, we would go back and nail them off, adding 3 nails in a row vertically, roughly every 16 inches. Also, this was Eric's first time using a cordless framing nailer, and needless to say, he was pretty impressed.
Dude, that's not bad.
After nailing off one side, we could add the 3rd layer and nail off the opposite side using the same nailing pattern, and then we had one section of the girder built. To attach the girder to the post base bracket, we use these 1.5 inch long connector screws, which are specified by the manufacturer. We could then continue on building the rest of the girders, working out from the center of the building until we got to the end sections of the girders. And we needed to switch to 16-foot 2x12s here, since we had a longer overhang at each end of the building. And we let the boards run wild at the ends and cut them to length after assembling the beams. And after thinking about it, we decided the best tool to cut these beams would be my electric chainsaw, since it could cut through the entire beam in one pass. And I was afraid it might be a little tough to get a clean square cut here, but it was actually pretty simple to cut to my line if I just took my time.
Dude, that was easy.
Dang.
This is a shockingly clean cut too.
Yeah.
Whew, not bad at all.
And Eric, of course, had to try his hand at this and was equally impressed.
I mean,
What the heck, dude? I'm never gonna use a skill saw again.
I mean, yeah. I don't think there's any better way to do that.
We could check our accuracy, and we were pretty darn happy with the results.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Look at us, dude. Look at that.
That's the best I've ever done. That's really good.
That's pretty good.
We repeated the same process on the other beam, and now we could move on to getting the floor system framed. First, though, we needed to pick up the lumber for the floor system framing, and this ended up turning into a bit of a saga of its own.
I'm en route to go get Johnny or help him or something. He went to Home Depot, loaded his truck with way more stuff than is supposed to go in a half-ton Chevy, like way more. We're gonna see in a second. And then, guess what? The thing is dead, like won't even start. And he calls me pretty upset about it because he spent all morning just loading the truck and now it's dead, loaded in the parking lot. We're gonna go see if we can help him out. Let's see. Chevy truck. There he is. Wow! So the truck won't start, but let's start with something else, because, I mean, what? This truck is freaking flattened. That's impressive. That's
ambitious, man.
that's as good a job as I've ever done trying to destroy a truck right there.
What we
So
call 2 tricks.
yeah. Yeah. All right. Now we can get to work.
Once the layout was marked on both girders, we could finally get some boards moved back to the site, get them cut to length, and then start getting the joists set in place on the girders.
So we're gonna set our first joist, 2x12, and a couple things we're gonna do before we set all of them is flip it up and sight down. We're looking for crown, like this way. And we're gonna set them all with the crown up so that the floor doesn't do that. So this is crowned up this way, put them all the same or you will hate the floor later.
After getting one joist set at each end of the building, we set up a string line running across the ends of these joists, which we could use as reference when setting the rest of the joists. And we wanted the ends of the joist just touching the string here, as this would ensure the ends of each joist were all perfectly in line. One other thing we noticed at this point was that the end of this girder had a slight twist to it and wasn't perfectly plumb. To fix this, we attached a long board to the girder to give us some leverage, and were able to pull the girder into plumb before reattaching the joists. We set the rest of the 12-foot long joists at the other end of the building and then called it a day, since the lumber loading fiasco had set us back quite a bit. The next day we got back to work and finished setting the rest of the joists in the center section of the house, and we were joined by 2 more members of the Perkins crew, Ray and Jason, and it was pretty crazy how much faster things went with a few more sets of hands, and Ray and Jason got to work cutting the center joist to length while Eric and I set up another string line. The center joists are longer than the joists at each end of the building, and the overhang on the back side of the house creates a bump out, which provides more area in the kitchen and living area, and the overhang on the front will end up as a small deck, which will then transition to the Paver patio area. Anyway, after getting the joists in the center section set, we came back and added hurricane ties at each end of the joist where they met up with the girders. And these hurricane ties securely attach the floor system to the foundation and prevent the building from lifting during high winds or shifting during seismic activity. Next, we could add the rim joist to each end of the joist, and these are attached with 4 nails into each joist. When attaching the rim joist, one person would man the nail gun, while another one made sure the joist was square to the girder and raised or lowered the end of the board so the top edge was flush with each joist.
Up, 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 up. Use your muscles.
We repeated the process on the rest of the rim joist sections, and then we needed to come back and add blocking where the floor joists in the center section transition from interior floor space to exterior deck. And this blocking needed to be added so that insulation could be added between the floor joists later, and it also helped to support the edges of the subfloor material in that area. With that, the floor framing was done, so we could move on to sheathing the floor, and I went with 3/4 inch thick Advantech subfloor panels here.
Oh yeah, this is gonna be easy. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Unfortunately, I didn't have a forklift on site to unload the material, so we had to unload about 100 sheets of sheathing by hand, and it was quite the workout unloading these and then moving them back to the site. Thankfully, my buddy Alex from the Single Track Sampler was around to help out, and the truck driver was even nice enough to lend a hand as well. Anyway, back to sheathing, we started by snapping a chalk line about 1/2 inch in from the edge of the rim joist, and this gave us a good clean line where we could start all of our sheets. To install the Advantech, we first laid down a bead of this Advantech subfloor adhesive on the top edge of all the joists.
Whoa!
And adding this adhesive is a really important step, as it'll help prevent squeaks in the subfloor later on. To attach the subfloor to the joist, we used 3-inch ring shank nails, which was total overkill, but will again ensure the subfloor doesn't lift and start squeaking in the future. And screws would have been even better here, but we were in a bit of a time crunch, and it's hard to beat the speed of a framing nailer. The first row of sheathing went down super quick since they were all full-length panels, but we needed to cross-cut a panel in half to start the next row so that the butt joints, where the ends of the 2 panels met, were staggered. And the track saw made quick work of this cut, and after cutting the panel, we could add more subfloor adhesive, also adding it to the groove this time. To help set the groove on the new panel onto the tongue on the previous row, we used a scrap piece of wood and a mini sledgehammer, and it's important to use some kind of scrap block here to prevent damaging the tongue. We repeated the whole process for a third row, which was another row of full panels, so it went super quick. The final row of sheathing to install was in the area where the backside of the house will bump out in that kitchen and living area, and I ripped the subfloor pieces to size for this final row, again using the track saw. Because there wasn't a groove on 2 of those ripped pieces, we needed to add blocking underneath the subfloor where those panels met up to help support those pieces. Once the blocking was added, we could attach the strips in the same way, and since the delivery of the framing material hadn't quite arrived yet, we called it a wrap and had a little bit of fun christening the subfloor with my hoverboard.
Even in the boots.
Wow, you're good. You're almost as good as my kids. Wow.
Oh, wow.
Ray, you gonna try that thing?
Then you bust your head with the other.
There you go. All right. All right.
See that cat like speed meat busted together.
All right. So, yep.
Okay. All right. Just hop on.
There you go. Yeah, man. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, there you go. Look at you. No flailing. Oh, there we go.
Wow.
Jason's natural.
Quits where I busted.
Natural. That's cool. It's christened.
Wow.
And next we could move on to framing the walls. The first step was to lay out the locations of the walls, starting with the exterior walls. And since the exterior walls will be framed with 2x6s, we marked in 5.5 inches at each end of a wall section, and then snapped a chalk line connecting those 2 marks. We then repeated this process around the entire perimeter of the building, and then we could mark out the interior wall locations. And the interior walls will be framed with 2x4s since they aren't load-bearing. Next, we got started framing the first wall, first cutting the top and bottom plates to length at 12 feet, and then we can mark layout on the plates.
So we're gonna hook, that's basically flush on your outside of your frame, 2-foot centers. You're gonna basically do a corner. This is a framer's dream come true. Right here, 2-foot centers.
No windows.
12-foot wall, no windows. Oh man.
Yep. That's big 12, we call that. Big 12.
Once the layout was marked, we set the plates in place on the floor and then got the studs we needed cut to length.
All right, 91.5, and then we got 4.5 for plates. So 91.5 plus a half is 92, plus 4 is 96.
Confirmed.
Let's write that down. 91, 1/2. This is so I don't inch monster any of these studs and then nail it in a wall and realize I cut one 1 inch long or 1 inch short, which doesn't sound like it would happen, but trust me, it happens. I'll just kind of destroy a tape and just, we're just gonna mark on it. That's our stud. I can just reel it out and not even have to think about it.
Makes sense. Get some dry erase markers, man.
Yeah.
While Ray continued cutting more studs to length, Eric and I started getting the wall framed, first crowning all of the studs, making sure they were crowned in the same direction. After assembling the inside corner, we could get the outside corner put together, which required a few more pieces of lumber to be added. The piece towards the outside of the building would serve as a nailer for the corner trim on the outside of the building, and the piece towards the inside would be a nailer for the wall covering on the inside of the building. And by assembling the pieces in this U-shape, insulation can still be added to this area later. Once the corner was assembled, we added the rest of the studs, and the nailing pattern here was 3 3-inch ring shank nails at each end of each stud. We repeated the same process at the other end of the building with another identical wall, since this tiny house is basically mirrored on both ends, and then we could get the wall tacked in place against the floor of the building. And doing this not only allowed us to straighten the bottom plate of the wall by lining it up with the chalk line we had marked earlier, but it also created a kind of hinge which helped keep the wall in place when we stood it up later.
We'll still do this. Take a side on it. It looks good.
Next, we squared the wall by pulling some diagonal measurements and making sure those numbers matched, and then Eric added one more nail to tack the wall in this square position so that we could add the sheathing. Before adding the sheathing, we snapped a line 3 feet up from the bottom of the bottom plate, and this would ensure the sheathing would overlap onto the rim joist, which both further weatherproofs the building but also helps tie the walls to the floor.
Ready? Drop the hammer.
Next, we attach the sheathing, and you'll notice that Eric and his crew typically run their sheathing horizontally. And the reason for this is it allows the studs to be straightened during the sheathing process. To make sure the studs were straight, Eric marked where each stud should land before attaching the sheathing, and removing any bow from the studs will make fastening the interior wall coverings a lot easier later on. And just like the floor sheathing, we cross-cut a panel with the track saw to start the second row so that the butt joints were staggered. We continued attaching more sheathing until we got to the top row where we needed to rip a panel into strips. And we also made sure to rip these pieces wide enough so they'd overlap the double top plate, which would be added after all of the walls were stood up. When taping these seams, the tape needed to overlap in the same way as shingles would, with the tape higher on the wall overlapping the lower tape. And to accomplish this, we just worked our way up the wall until we got to the topmost seams, rolling the tape as we went. We repeated the entire sheathing process on the other wall we had framed, and then we could get the walls stood up. Before staining the walls, we attached some temporary bracing so that we could lock the walls in place once they were upright and plumb. Staining the wall was easy enough with the three of us, and you can see that those hinge nails we added earlier kept the wall from sliding off the edge of the floor when lifting it. Once the wall was upright, Eric added a screw to tack it in place, and then added another block to the floor where we could attach the cross bracing on that end. We got the wall plumb before attaching the bracing, and once the wall was braced plumb, we attached the bottom plate to the floor with more nails, making sure the nails went into the rim joist below. We also nailed that overlapping sheathing to the rim joist, which again helped tie the walls to the floor. Once those walls were stood up, we finally got to a wall with a window opening. And in case you've never framed a window opening, they can be framed in a few fairly simple ways, but they can be a little confusing the first few times you do it. The other main component of a door or window opening is the header, which is supported by the jack studs. And because of this, you need the header to be 3 inches wider than the rough opening so that it can be supported by the jacks. Once the end wall was framed, we partially sheathed it and got it stood up, and then we could attach that end wall to the 2 side walls to tie everything together. We came back and added the rest of the sheathing and got the seams taped, and then we attempted to cut out the excess sheathing from the window opening, but had to put that on hold since the reciprocating saw blade we had wasn't quite long enough. We repeated the process at the other end of the building, and I also worked on laying out the big center wall, which has a whopping 5 window openings. I of course screwed this up at some point along the way, so we had to flip the plates and lay everything out again, but thankfully Eric knew what he was doing and we got it right the second time. We got the wall squared up and sheathed, and we also wised up and went ahead and cut out the window openings while the wall was on the ground, since that's a lot easier than trying to do it on a ladder. To cut the opening, we used a router with a flush trim bit, and this made really quick work of the process and left us with a super clean cut. The only downside is that this foam insulation dust is extremely itchy, and I had some pretty itchy forearms for the rest of the day.
Boom!
Anyway, once the wall was framed and sheathed, it was time for a pretty big moment, standing up this 24-foot long wall section, and I pulled out the drone to try and capture just how big this wall was.
1, 2, 3, waist. All right, shoulder. 1, 2, 3, shoulder. All right, walk her on up.
Thankfully, with all 4 of us, it was actually pretty easy to stand up, and once it was upright, we made sure to add plenty of cross bracing since this wall was unsupported until the walls that divide the building into its separate rooms were framed later. The last exterior wall to frame was the front wall on the center section of the house, and this is where that huge 16-foot wide sliding door will be located. So again, we used 3 layers of these 9.5 inch wide by 1 3/4 inch thick LVL beams for the header here, which was kind of overkill, but should definitely keep the header from deflecting and sagging over time. We assembled the header in place rather than trying to lift it into place pre-assembled, and this made things a lot easier. We also added a backstop on the front of the wall to keep the LVLs from falling off the front of the wall while assembling it. To assemble the header, we nailed the layers together using more 3-inch ring shank nails and added a row of nails roughly every 12 inches. After assembling the header, we added some pieces of blocking to the top of the header, which basically act as cripples where the rafters will land above this header, and then finally we added the top plate across the header to finish up the framing. That pretty much wrapped up the exterior wall framing, and the following day most of the Perkins crew were on hand to get the roof framed, but first we needed to finish getting the interior partition walls framed so that we could get the double top plates added. Jamie and I worked on getting one of those walls framed, and we started by getting the layout marked on both plates. Before actually framing the wall, we got the ever-present leaves moved out of the way so we'd end up with a flat wall. And then we got to framing, starting with assembling one of the L-shaped sections where the two interior walls would intersect. After framing that half of the wall, we worked on framing the door opening, and we added a piece of sheathing between the jack studs on both sides of the opening so that the door would be centered in this hallway section. We also ripped down a 2x6 to use as the header here rather than using a 2x4, and this was to keep from having to add some tiny cripples above the header. With that, the wall was framed, so we got it stood up and attached to the adjoining walls, making sure all of the walls were plumb while we were at it. And the front wall was simple since it was already braced by the other walls, but the two walls at the back of the house needed a little bit of tweaking to get them plumb. Thankfully, we had about a dozen sets of hands on site that day, so this was pretty easy, and once we got everything locked together nice and plumb, we could come back and get all of the double top plates added. In case you're not familiar, these double top plates span across two adjoining wall sections and help to attach them more securely. Double top plates also help carry the load of a rafter when it lands between studs, and we technically didn't even need them here since all of our rafters line up with a stud or a header. And next we needed to get the roof built. The first step in getting this roof framed was setting up some supports for the ridge board to which the rafters will be attached. And we built this roof in roughly 12-foot sections, so we started by getting two supports set up on either side of the master bedroom. Next, we could mark our 24-inch on center rafter layout on the ridge board, which was a 2x8 in our case.
That's your 1X there, and then we actually want space.
Do we want it opposite of that? We need this one flush.
Oh, this one needs to go here, and then...
Yep. Whoever takes this building apart one day, gonna be like, what are these people doing?
Yeah.
After finally getting the correct layout marked, we could get the first section of the ridge board mounted on the supports. Next, we needed to get our rafter layout worked out, and this first rafter would end up being a pattern for the rest of the rafters, so we really took our time making sure things were laid out accurately. Also, since the rafter tails on this house are exposed and need to continue out horizontally in the soffit area, we didn't actually cut a bird's mouth on these rafters like you might typically see. Instead, we cut a straight line perpendicular to the parallel angle cut on the ends of the rafters. The last bit to cut on the rafter was a notch section along the top edge of the rafter at the bottom end of the board. And this notch will house a layer of 3/4 inch radiata pine plywood and will be the show face on the underside of the exposed rafter tail and soffit area, which you'll see a little later. After getting that fixed, we could finally set the first two rafters in place, which was as simple as screwing them into place at both ends just to hold them in place temporarily, and then we went back and toe-nailed the rafters at the ridge beam. And the rafters were more permanently attached at the double top plate a little later, which I'll show in a bit. From there, it was really just rinse and repeat, using that first rafter as a pattern for the rest of the rafters and setting them in place with a 24-inch on center spacing. We repeated the same process of setting the rafters at the other end of the building above the guest bedroom, and then we could move to the center section of the building, which was essentially the same except for the slightly different rafters on the back half of the building. So as you might have noticed during the wall framing video, this back wall is actually about 6 inches shorter than the rest of the exterior walls. And this is to accommodate the cathedral ceiling in this area, where this part of the building extends past the rest of the structure. Lowering the wall height meant the rafter would meet up with the wall in a different location, and we had to cut the rafters in this area accordingly. Anyway, we got the rest of these rafters set, and then I could go around and permanently attach the rafters to the double top plates. And there are a few ways to do this, with the most common probably being metal rafter ties or hurricane ties, but installing those are incredibly time consuming due to how many fasteners need to be added to each tie. Instead, I went with these truss screws, which I saw in one of Eric's videos, and these are designed specifically for connecting rafters or trusses to top plates with a single screw at each location. Anyway, I finished adding the truss screws right as the guys were setting the last rafter in place, and I had to get this pretty momentous occasion on camera.
All right.
This is it, Johnny.
Rolling.
The last rafter.
Last rafter.
Woo!
Oh!
And the gun's like, we're done. That's it.
Yeah, we're done for the day.
With that, the rafters were set, and it was incredibly exciting to see the final roof line of the building in real life after staring at a 3D model and building plans for months. That said, we were still far from being finished with the roof framing, and next we got to work installing the blocking between each of the rafters. And typically this area would be covered by the soffit, but again we're going to have this area open with exposed rafter tails, so this blocking needed to be added to close up the interior of the house. We also ripped a matching angle on the top edge of the blocking so that it would butt up against the roof sheathing cleanly. Once we got all the blocking added between the rafters, we went back and added collar ties at each rafter location, and since this house will have cathedral ceilings through the majority of the areas, these collar ties serve both to help hold the rafters tight to the ridge board, but also help to resist the spreading force created by the downward pressure of the weight of the roof. Before adding our fascia board to the end of the rafters, we went ahead and snapped a chalk line so that we could trim any protruding rafters, since this would cause the fascia board to be wavy. Eric whipped up a quick jig for marking the vertical line on the rafter tails where we'd need to cut them, and this jig could then be aligned with the chalk line on the top surface, and Eric could then mark the vertical line using the jig. Finally, he could cut any extra long rafter tails using a circular saw, following the line he just marked. We repeated this process on any of the other protruding rafter tails, getting the ends of the tails all in line with each other, and then we could move on to adding the fascia. Typically this board would be called the subfascia, since you'd have some kind of trim on the face of the board and soffit material on the underside, but again we're going with an exposed rafter tail and soffit area. Because of this, these fascia boards will serve as the finished surface, so we wanted them to look as clean as possible. To help with this, we first squared up one edge of the boards, which matched the look of the rafter tails more closely. After ripping a square edge on one edge of the board, we then tilted the blade to match the roof pitch and ripped the other edge of the board with this angle. Next, we could get the first board cut to length, and I also went ahead and started 2 screws at each rafter location just to make it easier to drive the screws once I was up on the ladder. As you can see, there's a 6-inch overhang at the gable end of the roof, and we accounted for this overhang when attaching the fascia, allowing it to extend past the last rafter. We attached the fascia with 2 3-inch screws into each rafter tail, and this allowed for some tweaking if anything wasn't pulling together tightly. After getting all the fascia boards attached to the front half of the house, we could add the layer of plywood sheathing to the notched area of the rafters. And you might be wondering why we added this layer of plywood, and it's because again this area will be exposed in the finished house. If we didn't have this additional layer of 3/4 inch plywood, the roofing nails, which are 1 1/4 inch long, would have protruded through the underside of the roof sheathing, which would have looked terrible. Also, the pine plywood matches the pine rafters, blocking, and fascia, so it'll look more consistent even though they'll all be painted. Once the plywood was added, we could finally start getting the roof sheathed, and this was a pretty exciting moment because as soon as this was done, we'd have a dried-in building. The roof sheathing, which was 5/8 inch zip system roof sheathing in our case, went on pretty much just like the floor and wall sheathing, and the only annoying part was getting the sheets up onto the roof. We also made sure to leave the sheathing overhanging by 6 inches at each end of the building so we could attach our gable fascia to the sheathing later. Once again, we made sure to stagger the butt joints at the ends of the panels, and once again the nailing pattern was printed right on the sheathing, so attaching it was really simple. After getting the fascia added, we repeated the roof sheathing process on this half of the roof, which went super quick. With the roof sheathing on, the only thing left to do to get the roof watertight was to seal up the open area where the ridge vent will be installed. And since I knew this roof wouldn't have shingles installed for at least a month, we went ahead and ran a strip of 9-inch wide zip tape along the entire ridge, and this 50-foot long roll was pretty much perfect for this roof. Now, because I know someone is going to say something about adding this tape and it not allowing ventilation, we will be cutting away this tape from the ridge vent area before adding the roofing. This was just a temporary solution to get the building dried in. Anyway, moving on, we could get the fascia added at the gable ends, and first we snapped a chalk line and cleaned up the edge of the roof sheathing here just to make sure the fascia ran nice and straight. Next, I got one of the fascia boards cut to length, making parallel angled cuts at each end, and the angle here once again matched the roof pitch. I cut the board a hair long on the first try, but after taking a hair off, Eric got the board temporarily attached to the roof sheathing. We repeated the process with the other board, and Eric actually fine-tuned this board with a circular saw while up on the roof before getting it attached to the sheathing. Once both boards fit well, we ran more screws to attach the board to the sheathing more securely, as well as to the eave fascia, and we tweaked the boards as needed to get them in line with the edge of the sheathing, which we knew was straight. We repeated the process at the other gable end, and then we could move inside the house to finish the framing in the gable area. For framing here, I added a 2x6 perpendicular to the rafter, and this would serve both as a place to attach the cripples, but also the additional overhang on the inside of the house would give me an area to attach the ceiling covering, which again will be plywood in our case. Next, we got the cripples cut and attached, which was a bit of a slow process since we wanted to make sure they aligned vertically with the studs below. Finally, I added one more layer of blocking between the cripples, and this is where the plywood panels will break since this is right at the 8-foot mark, so we needed some extra material behind this area to screw the panels to. With that, the roof framing was done, and we could go back and add the wall sheathing to the gable area on the outside of the house to get everything sealed up. And these pieces were a little bit funky to cut, but we eventually got them attached and taped all the seams. While we were at it, we went back and added the last few pieces of missing sheathing where we hadn't gotten to it during the wall framing, and once those pieces were taped up, we could officially call this house dried in. And we did a little more interior framing prior to the plumbers and electricians coming out, but besides that, the roof was the last thing we got done before our new kit arrived on November 9th. Roughly a month later, I got back to work on the house, getting the windows and doors installed. And this step would really get the house a lot more watertight, and it would also get those windows and doors out of our garage where they had been sitting for the last few weeks. I started the installation process by taping the window sill, which is the only tape required by Pella inside the window opening. And I use zip stretch tape here, which is a super cool product that has a ton of flexibility when working around these corners.
Move outside.
Next, I got the sides of the window opening taped, and this was mainly for air sealing. I added one piece of standard zip tape to each side of the opening, and I did need to cut a slit at the sill and top of the opening to allow this tape to lap onto the sides of the opening. Once again, I rolled each piece of tape after applying it, and once both of those pieces were added, I could add another piece across the top of the window opening to seal up that part of the sheathing. To install the window, we first folded out the nail fin, which comes folded flat from the factory. Next, I added a bead of silicone around the top and two sides of the window opening, but didn't add caulk along the bottom edge so that any water that may eventually work its way into the sill has a place to drain. To help center the window in the rough opening, I placed 3 carpenter's pencils on the sill as spacers. With that, I was ready to place the window in the opening, and my buddy Eddie was on hand to help hand me the window and then run inside to make sure I had the window centered in the opening side to side. We also checked the window for level and plumb on the inside, shimming if needed, and once that was confirmed, I could tack the window in the opening with a few 2-inch long roofing nails. After tacking the window in a few spots, I double checked the window was level and plumb and that the window frame was square, and then I could add nails to the rest of the holes in the nailing fin. The number of nails you'll need to add will vary by manufacturer, but Pella requires every hole in the nailing fin has a nail added, so I got to work with my hammer. After adding all the nails, I could check that the window still functioned well, which it thankfully did, and I just love how smooth these casement windows operate. With that, I could get the last pieces of tape added to waterproof around the nailing fin, starting with one piece along each side of the window. And once again, I didn't add tape along the bottom of the window to allow drainage in case any water ever builds up in the sill. The last piece of tape to add was along the top of the window, and once that piece was added and rolled, this window was essentially waterproof. Next, we could move on to getting the doors installed. We started by installing the smaller entry door because we figured it'd be a little simpler, and the first step was to cut away the bottom plate from the door opening, which I did with a reciprocating saw. After removing the bottom plate, we swept out the door opening, and then we could get the sill pan assembled. And it was super cold the morning we got this assembled, so I had to encourage the glue out of the bottle with a little clamping pressure, but eventually I got the glue added and the pieces clamped together. After the glue had a chance to dry, I checked the floor and the door opening for level and checked the sides of the door opening for plumb, and once I confirmed they were all good to go, I could get the sill pan installed. To do this, I added caulk along the bottom of the door opening, up the sides of the door opening, and along the front of the house where the sill pan would lap over that area. Next, I put the sill pan in the opening, making sure it was well adhered to the caulk. The last step to prepare the opening for the door was to air seal the sheathing, just like I did with the window opening with more zip tape.
They're sealed.
Finally, we could set the door frame into place, and it was at this moment that we realized that we framed the rough opening essentially the exact same size as the door frame, which meant we really had to work to get the door into the opening. So as it turns out, we didn't have the rough opening dimensions for this particular door when we framed the house and just used kind of a standard rough opening size, but this door needed a slightly oversized door opening. Thankfully, the door frame fit into the opening with a little bit of persuasion, and to make sure the door was fully seated, we clamped the door frame into the opening. Next, we got the door frame secured in the opening using screws, first adding one 3-inch screw through each of the hinge screw locations, and then adding more screws on the other side of the frame underneath the weather stripping so the screws were hidden. Because this door frame was so tight in the door opening, we didn't really need to do much shimming, but typically you'd need to add shims on both sides of the door frame to get it centered in the rough opening. Finally, we could reinstall the door, and with a little bit of tweaking, the door was working great and looked great. With that, the entry door was installed, and next it was on to something that I had been stressing over since the doors arrived, getting the huge sliding door installed. And this was basically the same process as installing the other entry door, but obviously I had a 16-foot wide door opening to contend with this time, so making sure that opening was flat was a little bit more work. As it turned out, the subfloor was a little high at a few of the joist locations, so I started by finding those spots with a level, making sure any nail heads were below the surface, and then removing material from those spots with the electric planer. And this was the worst spot in the door opening, and after fixing this spot, I just worked my way along the rest of the opening, making sure the whole area was nice and flat. Once that was done, we cleaned off the opening and then started to dry assemble the sill pan, which was just a bunch more of the pieces I used on the previous opening. After assembly, we could go ahead and get the rest of the sliding door, which comes in 2 halves for shipping purposes, moved out to the house. Thankfully, the sliding doors can be removed, which makes the whole assembly a lot lighter, but it was still quite the process to get the doors from our garage out to the house. Once the doors were moved in, we got them laid out on the floor of the kitchen and living room area, which took up just about the entire room so that we could get the 2 halves joined together. Also, in case you're wondering, this massive sliding door was actually cheaper than the cost for 3 standard sliding doors which we were initially planning to install, and this door was also about 75% cheaper than some of the fancier accordion or multi-slide doors you might have seen, making it a great budget option. Anyway, after getting the door assembled, we got it stood up,
A big door.
and slid it out onto the deck before adding the sill pan, since the door wouldn't fit through the opening with the sill pan in place. Also, just for some added security, I clamped the door to the house so it couldn't fall over while we worked on the sill. Next, we repeated the process of adding the sill pan and sealing the door opening, but we also went ahead and added a layer of stretch tape to further seal up that sheathing between the joists, just for good measure. With that, it was time for the big moment of truth, sliding the door into the opening, and thankfully this went fairly uneventfully. It was definitely awkward because there wasn't really anything to grab onto to lift the door, but we eventually got it into the opening and got it centered, and then we attached it to the house through the nail fin in a few spots. With that done, we could finally get the 2 sliding doors installed, which was again a little awkward due to the weight of these huge doors. Eventually though, we got them both added, and let me tell you, it was a huge relief to finally get this door installed.
Oh!
I installed the door handles off camera and then made a few adjustments to get the height of the rollers dialed in, and once that was done, this massive door was officially installed. The last thing to do to wrap up the door and window installation was to add spray foam in the areas between the window and door frames and the rough openings. And this foam air seals these gaps and is essential to making your house energy efficient. I went a little overboard with the foam, so after it dried, I came back and trimmed off any excess and also sanded any spots where it got on the bare wood on the inside of the windows, since these windows are unfinished on the inside. Once that was done, I double checked that all of the windows and doors still functioned well, and then I could officially call the windows and doors installed. Let's rewind a bit and talk about the rest of the interior framing work we did, which you really need to have done prior to any electrical or plumbing work.
Reps of that. Functional fitness. Okay, I'm done.
Anyway, we were framing the bathroom walls here in this shot, and after getting the first wall built and stood up, we framed the adjoining wall, which has the door opening for the bathroom. And this wall creates a kind of hallway as you enter the house through the entry door, and after framing the wall, we got it stood up and attached to the other two walls. A few weeks later, I got back to work, unfortunately by myself, starting with adding the cripples to the wall between the master bedroom and bathroom. And I also needed to add another piece on the underside of the rafters here to give myself a larger area to attach the cripples. Once that was done, I could add that last ceiling joist, which will also act as a nailer for the drywall ceiling in this area. After adding that last joist, I also went back around and added a 2x6 across the top plates of these 2x4 interior walls, and these will act as nailers for the drywall in those areas. Also, in case you're not familiar with this nailer terminology I've been using kind of throughout the whole framing process, a nailer is basically just an additional piece of framing that's added so that you have a spot to attach your interior wall coverings later, which I'm illustrating here with these two pieces of plywood. I repeated the cripple framing process on the partition wall between the living area and the guest bedroom. Once that was done, the interior framing work was pretty much complete, so I could have my electricians and plumbers come out to get their work started. The electricians started outside, getting the conduit ran in the trench running from our main house to the tiny house. We aren't running a separate meter to this new house, but instead are just running a sub panel to the tiny house from the panel in our main house. Once the electricians figured out where they wanted the conduit to end, they could start assembling it in the trench, starting on the back side of the tiny house where the panel will be located. They continued running the conduit in the trench, and as you can see, each joint needed to be glued so that the conduit was watertight. Once they got closer to the main house, they went ahead and ran the electrical lines through the conduit, starting by running some pull line through the conduit so the wire could be more easily pulled through later. My electrician, Robbie, had a really cool trick for getting the pull line through the conduit, and he started by tying a plastic grocery bag to one end of the line. Next, he placed a small shop vacs hose at one end of the conduit and turned it on to create some suction, and then he fed the plastic bag into the conduit at the other end.
Holy dude, that's insane.
And as you can see, even with just that little shop vac running, the pull line was fed through the conduit super quick, and after running back to the other end of the conduit, we found the bag and pull line.
That is quite brilliant.
Next, Robbie cut off a few of the strands on each of these huge wires and bent them over to create a kind of hook where he could attach the pull line. And he tied and taped the pull line to the wire and then could finally run it through the conduit, which was a super easy process with the pull line attached. Once that was done, the guys could get back to running the conduit all the way to the house, and they went ahead and pulled the wire at this point in the process, as there were a whole bunch of turns left to add, which would have added a lot of friction if they had waited to pull the wire later. They got the rest of the line run into the panel in our garage, and then they could move into the tiny house to get the electrical work started inside. They started by drilling the holes for running Romex through the studs, and then got the various electrical boxes mounted throughout the house, but unfortunately that's where they ran out of time on this first day, and it was a few more weeks before they could come back to finish things up. In the interim, I got a few more things done so that they'd be able to wrap things up when they came back, starting by installing these cathedral ceiling mounts, which will be used for the ceiling fans and hanging lights throughout the house. And these were super simple to install and just attached with 2 screws into the collar ties in my case, and these will either be painted or wrapped with the plywood I plan to use on the walls and ceiling. And I started with the electrical outlet on the front of the house between the entry door and the sliding door. I first got a hole cut through the sheathing centered between the 2 doors for the outlet box to go through, and somehow I ended up cutting this way oversized and should have just used my PVC mount as a template, but it's nothing a little spray foam on the inside of the house won't fix. Once the box was sealed to the mount, I could get the whole assembly mounted to the wall, and I started by adding a heavy bead of an exterior rated sealant to the back of the PVC, and then I could squish the whole assembly onto the wall to really seal it up. This outlet box included some stainless mounting screws, but unfortunately they weren't quite long enough to go through this 1-inch PVC into the sheathing, and so instead I added some temporary screws, which I'll swap out for some lower profile stainless screws in the future. With that done, I could repeat a similar process to install the mount for the panel on the back of the house, once again adding a heavy bead of caulking around the perimeter of the mount. I then got it screwed to the wall, and then I could partially disassemble the panel so I could get it mounted on the PVC. I marked where the screw locations on the back of the panel landed on the PVC, pre-drilled those holes, and then screwed on the panel, and I also added some blocking on the inside of the house to this area so the panel was mounted more securely since it is fairly heavy. I repeated the same process to add another outlet next to the panel, which is required by code since I'll also be installing my mini split unit on this back wall. With all that done, my electrician could come back to wrap up the rough-in wiring. And with that, the electrical was pretty much wrapped up, and it was really exciting to see all of these wires run to the various parts of the house. I expect we'll pass our inspection with flying colors. Next up, let's talk about the plumbing rough-in process, most of which happened before we were finished with this electrical work. Before the plumber showed up, I wised up and made some better layout marks in the bathroom and kitchen in the form of painter's tape. Once the layout work was done, my plumbers came out and started getting the plumbing roughed in, starting by drilling all of the various holes for the water supply lines as well as the sewer drain lines. The plumbers continued drilling the rest of the holes for the hot and cold water supply lines, and then they dropped lengths of PVC and PEX into these holes so that they could easily see where the holes were on the underside of the house while hooking everything up. To keep the pipes from falling right through the holes, they added some scraps of PVC to the drain pipe and PEX hangers to the PEX, which temporarily held them in place, and I thought that was pretty clever. Next, they worked on getting the wall-hung toilet unit attached, and this unit is located between the studs inside the walls. Of course, the toilet location ended up landing dead center with a stud, so they got the stud cut out of the way, and then I added back a pair of studs on either side of where the unit would be located. The plumbers then got the unit bolted to the studs and the bottom plate, and then got it plumbed in, which was a little tricky, but they eventually got it figured out. The last bit of interior work was to get the shower mixing valve, shower head, and water heater plumbed, and then the rest of the work was under the house. They also ran PEX in the trench to our main house, where we'll be tapping into our water line for the main house. Before the rough-in inspection, the plumbers needed to add fire caulk anywhere the plumbing penetrated the studs, and they also had to cap off the entire system and add air pressure to check for any leaks. And the system had to hold that air pressure for a set period of time to pass inspection, which thankfully it did, and when that was done, our rough-in inspection was officially passed for the plumbing. With that, we could call our electrical and plumbing rough-in work pretty much done, which was a huge relief and meant that I could continue moving along with the build process on my own. We could move on to getting the soffit area prepped for paint, which we wanted to get done prior to roofing since it'd be a lot easier to paint the fascia without the drip edge installed. The first and most important task on the to-do list for this area was adding soffit ventilation, so that fresh air can make its way from the soffit up to the ridge vent, which will help keep the space below the roof deck better acclimated to changing weather. Because we have this exposed rafter tail detail, adding the soffit ventilation here was a little bit tricky. Thankfully, our architect Rick came up with the idea of using these round aluminum soffit vents, which both look cool but also add the needed ventilation. Since I obviously wanted these holes to look consistent from bay to bay, I went ahead and whipped up a quick drilling template so that my hole spacing would be easily repeatable. And there was a little bit of variation between the rafter spacing, so I made the jig slightly undersized widthwise, and it was simple to visually center the jig once I was up on the walkboard. I first pre-drilled the pilot holes using my template for reference, and then I pulled out this beast of a joist drill equipped with a 4-inch hole saw to drill the holes. And I certainly could have used a standard drill here, but this joist drill was not only way more powerful, so it drilled the holes more quickly, but it also had a built-in clutch to keep the drill from breaking my wrists if the hole saw got bound up in the hole. Once the holes were drilled, I went ahead and did a little finish prep work, giving the surfaces a quick sanding to clean up any rough edges, and then I caulked the seams. And this caulk made the whole assembly look a lot more finished, but it wasn't only for aesthetic purposes. This caulk also served to help air seal these areas, and because of this, I definitely erred on the heavier side when applying the caulk and used a high quality exterior rated elastomeric sealant. We just continued to work our way around the house, drilling holes, sanding, caulking, and filling any imperfections with putty, and thankfully my buddy Eddie was on hand to help with this process, and we got in a pretty good rhythm with me drilling the holes and then running inside to install the insulation baffles, which you'll see later, while Eddie followed behind me with the rest of the finish prep work. As you can imagine, this was a pretty slow and tedious process, and I can tell you that my shoulders were pretty much toast by the end of this first day after holding that joist drill all day. The process for drilling the holes was the same on the left and right ends of the back side of the house, but obviously with no roof overhang in that center bump out, things were a little different in that area. Rather than just being drilled into the blocking, the ventilation holes also needed to be drilled through the fascia in this area, and because of that I downsized to 3-inch vents here. This also meant that I was drilling through 3 layers of 2x material here, 4.5 inches of material, so this was a ton of work.
That was a lot of freaking holes, so super glad to be done with that. The last thing to do before getting to painting this whole area prior to roofing is gonna be filling in underneath this little area in the gable end overhang. Basically, it's the same deal as where we added the extra layer of plywood in this exposed rafter tail area. If we didn't add another layer of plywood there, the roofing nails would fire through. You'd see that in the final house, and obviously that wouldn't look very good. So we're just gonna basically cut out a couple little strips of plywood to kind of nail up underneath there, and then we'll be ready for paint.
Since I was painting bare wood here, I first applied a coat of Total Boat Topside Primer, which is a marine grade primer designed for undercoating enamel paints. And as you can see, this primer sprayed really well with no thinning and covered the bare wood in one coat, which is no easy task on Southern Yellow Pine. I followed up with 2 coats of Total Boat Elixir, which is a water-based enamel paint, and I used this paint on my shed project over the summer, and it's held up extremely well, so I figured I'd go with it again on this project. Thankfully, I got this soffit area painted just in time, as we had a decent amount of snow a few days later, and we've been getting a ton of snow and rain here over the last few weeks, and it's been really good to know this area was sealed up prior to getting the shingles on. Anyway, with the paint on, we were ready for roofing whenever the weather finally cleared up. The first step in the roofing process was installing the drip edge, which helps to divert the water coming off the roof into the gutters, which will be installed later. Drip edge also laps up the roof sheathing a few inches and helps to protect that area from water as well. Before installing the shingles, we needed to add a starter strip along the entire perimeter of the roof. Before installing the starter strip, so we went ahead and snapped 2 lines at the bottom of the roof, one for the starter strip and one for the first course of shingles. Once our lines were snapped, I cross-cut the first starter strip to offset the seam from the first course of shingles, and then I could get it installed, lining it up with my chalk line for the eave overhang, and just visually adding the 1/2 inch overhang on the rake. I continued installing starter strips around the rest of the roof perimeter, and I could finally get to installing the shingles themselves. So as I mentioned earlier, we had already gone ahead and cut a few sets of these initial courses while we were on the ground, and now I just needed to nail those in place. Once again, I lined up the top edge of the shingle with the chalk line and flushed the rake edge with the starter strip, and then I added 4 nails, adding 1 at each end, about 1 inch from the ends of the shingle, and then 2 more nails evenly spaced in the middle of the shingle. Next, I could add a full shingle to each course using the same nailing pattern, and you can see that this offset pattern keeps the seams on the shingles from landing on top of the seam in the previous course, which would be an area where water could easily work its way to the roof deck. And then we could continue running shingles like this until we got to the ridge. Once we had all of the courses started, we continued adding a full shingle to each course, and we really got moving across the roof quickly at that point. And then we just kept installing more shingles on the lower courses until we got to the end of the roof. I let the shingles overhang here, and after completing the first 4 courses, I came back to trim the overhanging pieces flush. I also used another shingle as a straight edge when cutting, and this really helped keep the cuts nice and straight. After cutting off the excess, I used a scrap piece of shingle to burnish the edges of the cut shingles, which cleans them up and helps them look more like a factory edge. And also, we were able to work these offcuts back in, and since our roof was 49 feet long, we had almost no waste left over, which was pretty awesome. And that was as far as we got on day 1, and unfortunately, I also crashed my drone while getting this shot, so there won't be any more drone shots until the very end of this video, once I got it back after sending it off to be repaired. With that done, I could get the next shingle installed, which needed to be notched around the vent pipe. And I used my utility knife for this and just took my time, so I ended up with a good fit around the pipe. Once the shingle fit well, I got it nailed in place, and then I could get the roof boot fit over the pipe. And the roof boot fit well, so I removed it to add some roofing cement, which I applied liberally around the perimeter of the underside of the boot. And then I reinstalled the boot over the pipe, nailing it to the roof. I added another heavy bead of roofing cement around the edge of where the shingle would lap over the boot, as well as over the nail heads lower on the roof boot to help seal them up. Finally, I got the shingle installed, nailing it in place and pressing it into the roofing cement, and I cleaned up any excess cement afterwards. I repeated the same process for the other 2 roof vents, first notching the lower course around the vent hole and attaching those shingles, then cutting a hole in the 2 shingles in the next course and attaching those shingles, then adding roofing cement to the underside of the vents and attaching them with roofing nails, then finally notching the last intersecting course and adding more roofing cement below that notched edge before attaching those shingles.
Okay. Thank the gods, we're done with that.
Once that was done, the rest of the roof was basically just rinse and repeat, and we finished up the shingles on this side of the roof in no time. And with no vents to work around, we were able to get this side of the roof shingled in just under 2 hours, which was insanely fast compared to the other side. We stopped short of the very top course on both sides of the roof, so after adding the rest of the courses on the front face of the roof, I laid out how everything would come together with the ridge shingles. And luckily, with one more course on both sides of the roof, the ridge shingles would cover pretty much perfectly, so I got to work adding the last course to the back side of the roof. Once that was done, I needed to trim these shingles flush with the ridge vent opening in the roof sheathing before adding the shingles on the other side of the roof, and once again, the hook knife was the perfect tool for this job, slicing through these shingles like butter. I also sliced through that temporary zip tape we had added during the roof sheathing process and removed it, as this area needs to be open for ventilation. To start the ridge vent, I first needed to install the first ridge shingle, and I cut a little starter strip from another ridge shingle and got that installed before installing the first ridge shingle. After adding the first ridge shingle, I could get the ridge vent installed, and I used Tamco's Rapid Ridge here. And this ridge vent can be installed with a nail gun, and it even comes with a roll of 1 3/4 coil nails for installation. With that done, we could finish off the roof by installing the ridge shingles. These needed to be overlapped with a little more than 5 inches showing, basically enough to cover the nails. Also, we did snap a chalk line for reference here, but it was nearly impossible to see since it was black chalk on black shingles. We just continued working our way down the roof until we got to the other end, where I added the last shingle with 2 more nails and added roofing cement to seal the nails. And with that, besides a little cleanup work, the roof was officially done. And next I can move on to installing the exterior trim. And the first pieces of trim I needed to install were along the underside of the blocking between the exposed rafter tails. We added trim along the entire front face of the house and the 2 ends on the back side of the house, but before we could install the remaining trim in the center section of the house and install the corner boards, we needed to seal up the bottom edge of the sheathing since the corner boards would overlap this edge. And sealing it up was pretty simple, and we just nailed some strips of pressure treated material to the bottom edge of the floor framing and then taped the joint between the sheathing and the treated material to seal everything up. And we did this around the entire perimeter of the house, and we did need to notch around the girders on the ends of the building, which was easy enough with a jigsaw. We used 5 4x4 boards for these back corners, and we started by ripping 1 inch off of 2 of the boards so that the finished corner boards would have a total width of 3.5 inches on both faces. Next, we cut the boards to rough length at the miter saw, leaving extra length for trimming later, and then we pre-assembled the corners in my garage shop. And I pre-assembled all of these trim pieces whenever possible, as it was much easier to install these corner boards and, as you'll see later, the window and door trim as pre-made assemblies rather than individual pieces. Anyway, back to installing the corner boards, we first squared up one end of the corner board assembly using the miter saw, and then we can mark the length based on the actual length of the building by temporarily setting the board in place. We then cut the board to final length using the miter saw and then installed it with those Cortex screws I had mentioned earlier, and I used the 2 3/4 inch long version since I was going through 1 inch of trim and 1 inch of sheathing and foam. Next, we added a vertical trim board centered on this back section, and the main purpose of this piece was to eliminate any butt joints in the siding installation, since those are both a pain to flash and caulk but also don't look that great visually. Once that board was up, we could get those last 2 pieces of upper trim installed, and with that, all of the upper trim was installed, and next we moved on to the window trim. Once again, we cut and assembled all of the window trim assemblies in the garage, and I was actually able to generate a cut list for all the pieces from my 3D model, which made cutting the pieces go super quick. We attached the lower rail pieces to the sills and used a few scrap pieces of 5/4 trim to set the offset between the pieces as the sill extends past the rails and stiles by 1 inch. Once those pieces were assembled, we could combine the 2 assemblies, attaching the bottom end of the stiles to the top of the sill, and with those assembled, we had our finished window frames. To install the flashing, I first added a bead of Duramaster to the back face of the flashing, pressed it in place above the window, and then tacked it in place with a few roofing nails. Next, I added a piece of zip tape along the top edge of the flashing, making sure to keep it up high enough so it wouldn't show between the window trim and flashing. Next, I set the window trim in place and got it centered on the window. And also, just as a note, I did add an extra 1/8 of an inch on both sides and bottom of the window to allow for caulking later, and I added 3/8 of an inch at the top of the window to account for the flashing. Once the window was set where I wanted it, I added more Cortex screws to attach the trim to the house permanently. And also you can see that there was no gap behind the trim due to that rabbet, which allowed it to sit flush on the sheathing. Once that was done, I went ahead and repeated the process on a few more windows, and then, since I had the walkboard set up, I went ahead and added clear silicone between the trim and window on both sides and the bottom of the window. I could then repeat the process on the other windows on the back side of the house, along with the windows on the ends of the house, all of which went quickly since the window frames were already pre-assembled, and then I could step back and admire our work. After installing the deck ledger flashing, we added zip tape to span between the sill pan and deck ledger flashing, and this should allow any water that gets into the sill pan to drain over the zip tape and onto the face of the deck ledger flashing.
All right.
With that finally out of the way, we could get back to installing trim, and we started by installing a piece of trim under both door thresholds. And this piece of trim not only looks nice, but it also helps to support the door thresholds where they overhang the front of the house. After that was done, we could install the rest of the door trim, but first I wanted to remove that brick mold trim that came pre-installed on this entry door. And I didn't even really know this trim could be replaced until I saw it done on the Perkins Builder Brothers channel. And unfortunately, I had added a ridiculous amount of caulk behind this brick mold when we installed the door, so it was a little difficult to remove. Once I finally had it removed, Eddie came back and added zip tape between the door jamb and the sheathing, making sure to keep it back far enough to where it wouldn't be visible once the trim was installed. I pre-assembled this door trim off camera using the same PVC trim adhesive and pocket screw method, and before installing it, I added 2 heavy beads of Duramaster to weatherproof this joint since there isn't a nailing flange on this door. Next, we set the frame in place and started adding screws, but we also needed to shim the frame in a few spots where the foam behind the sheathing had compressed a bit during framing. Once that was done, I added drip cap above the door, and then we could repeat the whole process on the big sliding door. The only big difference here was this door does have a nailing flange, so we went ahead and added rigid head flashing and drip cap just like we did on the windows. Also, we did rip the top trim board down so the height of the top edge of the trim on both doors matched, which I just think looks better. With that, all of the doors were trimmed out, and while we were in this area, we went ahead and added 2 more vertical trim pieces on either end of the deck. To start the installation on these corner boards, we needed to cut an 18.5 degree angle, which matches our roof pitch, on the top end of the trim assembly, and then notch it around the rafter tail. And I used a circular saw and jigsaw to do this, but I accidentally angled my jigsaw in the wrong direction, so instead of being able to easily scribe the angled edge to fit the house, the angled edge created a big gap.
All right, so let's knock that off.
Thankfully, we had some extra length here, and after fixing this mistake, we ended up with a nice fit and got the corner board attached to the house with more screws. Once that was done, I caulked the seams where the trim met up with the rafter tails, and then we just repeated the process on the other 4 corners of the building. With that, all of the trim was installed on the not-so-tiny house, and we were ready for siding.
So first of all, we went around and measured the distance between our trim boards all the way around the house just to see what our longest boards were going to need to be. And then with that number in mind, we went ahead and rough cut a board to length and then ripped some starter strips from that board at about 1.25 inches wide. And these starter strips are going to be the first thing you install along the very bottom of your sheathing, and that's going to be what helps to kick out that first row of lap siding and make that kind of angle match the rest of the lap siding up the wall. So again, since the bottom edge of our trim boards were level with one another, we could go ahead and install that first row with the bottom edge even with the trim board. Again, because we have 24-inch on center spacing on the framing on this house, we had to add nails every 8 inches, so basically on every stud and 2 nails between every stud. After getting that first row installed, things could start to move much quicker because now we could use those gecko gauges. So the way those work is they have this thin plate that slides up under your previous row of lap siding. And on the front of the gauges, they have this little arm that helps you lock the gauges into place. And after clamping down a gauge at both ends of that first row, we could set the next row in place and go ahead and get it nailed in place. And again, we had marked chalk lines on this first wall, so we could kind of use those just to make sure our gauges were working properly, but really they're pretty much foolproof as long as you make sure they're butted up securely against the bottom edge of that previous row. So after getting basically the first half of this first section sided, we went ahead and caulked all of those seams between the end of the siding and the trim boards, and I highly recommend doing this as you go. Since you already have your kind of walkboard or ladder or scaffolding set up, it makes it much easier to go ahead and do this caulking and get it out of your way. So after getting that PVC trim installed, we could get the last row of siding installed, and we obviously needed to rip it to width. Now luckily this was close to a full width piece of siding in our case, so we could just nail it in place. But if this ends up being a super narrow piece, in your case, you might want to add some sort of spacer strip behind this last strip to make sure those angles match up and then that last piece doesn't look kind of funky. So on this wall, we did run into the first thing we needed to work around with the siding, and that was this hose bib. You can see that we ended up with a really small sliver of this siding left on the upper edge of this penetration, and this is something that wouldn't have been really doable with fiber cement just because it's so brittle. And then the following day, the Perkins crew were on hand. So again, because these siding boards came in 16-foot lengths in my case, and all of my sections here were 12 feet or less, I had a lot of 4-foot offcuts, but this actually worked out really well because the lengths we needed next to these windows were almost exactly 4 feet. And this really just came down to a great design by our architect, Rick Caseby. We ended up with very little waste. And again, we do have plans available for this building if you're interested in building something like this yourself. And he really put a lot of thought into maximizing our efficiency so that one, we didn't send a lot of stuff to the landfill, but also it saves you a lot of money when you don't end up with a lot of waste.
All right, we're to this board that's gonna bump into the gable part of the roof. So what we need to do is cut an angle that's gonna match the bottom of the soffit. That's the bit that's gonna have a vertical into the corner board, and I need to make a line here to cut. So I'm gonna use the roof pitch, which is a 412 angle. So I'm gonna measure out 12 inches, the run, and I'm gonna put a mark the same height up as my vertical there, 5/8. And then I'm gonna measure up 4 inches from that. That's the rise in 1 foot. So in essence, I've just come over 1 foot and up 4 inches. That's the roof pitch. Connect those 2 points with a straight edge. And that should be the cut on the roof pitch. There are tools that will kind of help you do this without doing the math, like a big framing square with some locking nuts on it. You can set the angle, but that works pretty well. We'll go ahead and actually do something else here. Our lap is 7 inches and this speed square is 7 inches. So I'm gonna put a tick mark right there. And that's where the end of the next point is gonna be. I'll mark both ends, measure between them. Then we don't have to get up on the ladder to make any measurements for all the rest of the pieces going up, which is great. .102 5/8 will be along the next one. Can I write that on your workbench?
Sure.
Too late.
So we just continued cutting those angled pieces and installing them, and it did start to get really tight in this area. We only have a 6-inch overhang at the gable end of this house. So obviously there was a lot of stuff to work around on this back kind of center section on the house with all the windows and the electrical panel and the electrical outlet. We did have some pretty tiny slivers of siding between those corner boards and the windows, but luckily they were still wide enough to get those gecko gauges into. And so that was about as far as we got on day 2 of the siding install. And while it took Eddie and I a day to do 1.5 sections, it took me and the Perkins crew a day to do 5.5 sections. So things went a heck of a lot quicker with a couple extra hands. And Eric was nice enough to come back the following day to wrap up the siding on the rest of the house. And we started on the other end, which was again a super simple section because there was nothing to work around. We also went ahead and installed those last couple of pieces of upper trim on the front section of the house, and then we could get those last couple of pieces of siding installed above those doors. We needed to add another one of those kind of strips above the door to maintain that same kind of angle across where that piece of siding ran above the doors. And we just used some ripped down pieces of treated material here and ripped those down so that the angle would match the previous rows.
Okay, so now we're ready.
Also, as I mentioned, we only had that one butt joint on this entire house, and that was right above this large sliding door. And luckily this piece was super simple to flash. I just cut an offcut of some of the other flashing I had on hand and tucked that behind where those 2 pieces of siding met up so that any water that ever works its way into that seam will be pushed down, in this case, onto the flashing above the door, or if this was above another row of siding, it would push it on top of that row of siding below it. So with that, the siding installation was pretty much a wrap. I still have a couple spots that I still need to caulk here and there, but overall I think the siding install turned out great, and this thing is really starting to look like a finished house now.
I'm gonna show you how I installed the mini split units in this tiny house. That's right, units. I went with a multi-zone system, so I have 3 of these indoor units, 1 in each bedroom and 1 in this kind of living room kitchen area. So that way we have independent climate control in all 3 rooms, which is awesome. So we started by hanging the drywall in the guest bedroom here. Also, I went ahead and ripped ripped that first panel in half. That way the two drywall seams that we would need to tape and mud would be far away from the installed mini split unit. So with that drywall hung, we could go ahead and get the first indoor unit mounted, and this is a 9,000 BTU unit, which is honestly kind of overkill. These bedrooms are only about 125 square feet. I went ahead and removed the mounting bracket from the back of the unit, and then I could get the bracket mounted to the wall using some 2.5-inch screws, making sure it was nice and level. After getting the bracket mounted, I went ahead and drilled the hole for the line set, which is supposed to be a 3.5-inch hole. I went ahead and bumped it up to a 4-inch hole just to give me ample wiggle room trying to maneuver this through these indoor walls. So the line set that comes attached to the unit itself comes bent pretty tight down to the unit. So first you need to go ahead and bend that out. Again, you need to be pretty careful with these lines. They are copper. You can kink them if you're not careful. So I did that nice and slowly. And then we could feed that line set as well as the communication wire through that hole I had drilled and basically set the unit on top of the mounting bracket, making sure everything was positioned nicely. And then I could snap it into place onto the bracket to attach it permanently.
It's on.
And once I snapped it in place on the bracket, that first unit was hung on the wall. I repeated the whole process again in the other bedroom in this house, the master bedroom. I did need to cut around the water heater lines to hang some of this drywall, which was a little bit annoying, but again, that drywall cutting tool made quick work of that. This time, before mounting the unit, I did go ahead and drill a 3.5-inch hole through the top plate in the wall behind where the unit will mount so that I could feed those lines through that hole while I was mounting it, because otherwise the ceiling joist in this area would have gotten in my way. And after feeding that line set through the hole and setting that unit in place, the second unit was installed. The last unit to install was the one you see above my head here, which is in our main room. This is an 18,000 BTU unit, which is honestly really overkill for this space. With that, all 3 indoor units were hung so I could move outside to get the outdoor unit or condenser dealt with. We could lift the condenser onto the mounting bracket, adding some more rubber washers under the feet, again to help with vibration, and then bolted the condenser to the mounting bracket to make sure it wasn't going anywhere. Next, we can move back inside and get holes drilled through the bottom plate and through the floor for the line set to run through. And I made sure these were in line with the holes we had drilled in the top plate earlier. And once those holes were drilled, we could move back outside, get that line set unrolled, and then run it up through the floor of the house. And where this line set needed to run here on this unit in the kind of living room kitchen area was a little bit tricky because it had some bins to work around, but I just took my time and bent those slowly and basically worked the line set so that they got close to where they needed to be, and then I could actually make the connections. Connecting these lines is super simple. They come with color-coded plastic caps, so you really can't screw it up. I would just make sure to go ahead and thread them together by hand so you don't cross-thread them, which could create some leaks. And once they're threaded together, you can tighten them up with a couple of wrenches. Once I had fully tightened the connection, I sprayed everything down with soapy water to check for leaks, which thankfully we didn't have any of. And so then I could go ahead and wrap both of these connections with the sound deadening pads that are included with this system. And those sound deadening pads just help keep everything at that connection point nice and quiet. And then I could go ahead and use some metal strapping to totally secure the line set to the framing of the house. Next, I could go ahead and connect the included drainage hose to the drainage hose whip that comes off of the back of the indoor unit. And while this connection is probably plenty sturdy on its own, I wanted a little bit extra insurance and went ahead and wrapped it in some silicone tape. After connecting those two sections, I went ahead and insulated the rest of that drain pipe as well using some black foam insulation. And again, that's going to keep that drain line from sweating inside the walls, which again could lead to mold growth, which would be very bad. Once I had the rest of that drain line insulated, I could run the drain line as well as the communication wire down through the floor of the house. And then I went back and added some stud guard plates, which will keep me from inadvertently driving a screw or nail into these pipes in the future. I can then repeat the process for the other 2 line sets coming from the other 2 indoor units, running those line sets up through the floor, connecting them, checking for leaks, connecting that drain line, insulating that drain line, wrapping everything with that vinyl tape, and finally adding those stud guards. I also added fire foam to all of these penetrations through the top plates and bottom plates, and this is required by code, and this fire foam helps to keep smoke from spreading during a fire. It also helps to keep drafts from feeding a fire that's on a different level of the house. And I personally really like this fire foam versus the fire caulk because it spreads to fill these large openings, which is a lot easier in my opinion than trying to get caulk to fill these kind of penetrations.
That's what she said.
With the condenser in place, I could go ahead and get all the line sets attached to it. And this was basically the same process as attaching the line sets on the inside of the house. Everything was color coded, it just threaded together. Also, you'll notice that my electrician went ahead and wired up the outdoor unit to my panel, which is right there. And that is the one part of this project that you probably will need to have done by a tradesperson. And after checking for leaks on those line set connections, I could go ahead and open the refrigerant valves, which basically charge the whole system here. And this is really where you do not want to have leaks. So hopefully you've checked for leaks all along this process. If you do develop a leak, then you need to deal with it, because otherwise your refrigerant is going to be leaking out, which is a very, very bad thing. Once I confirmed there were no leaks, I could go ahead and run that communication wire into the little box on the outdoor unit, and I ran the wire through a cable clamp and then got it wired up, which is dead simple. Once that was done, I could repeat the same process for the other two units, again checking for leaks, opening those refrigerant valves, and then connecting the communication cable. And then I could open the master valves, which I didn't show in this clip. I turned off the camera before I got that done. And then once those valves were open, I could flip on the breaker, go inside, and turn on the units to test them out. So with that, the mini split units were installed, and now we're gonna have heating and cooling for the rest of this project, which is super, super exciting. I went ahead and added blocking at each end of the deck where the picture frame mitered boards would wrap around the front edges of the deck. Next, I cut the board to length with the miter saw, first cleaning up the factory end of the board. And the ends of these composite decking boards are far from square, and the boards come with extra length so you can trim off the factory ends without coming up short. Finally, I set the board in place, making sure it was 1/4 of an inch from the trim and 1/4 inch below the top edge of the deck to allow for expansion, and then I screwed it into place. We also needed to space the beveled ends to allow for expansion. I used an 1/8 inch spacer for this, and these little spacers, along with the 1/4 inch spacers included with the Craig system, were super handy during this process, and I'll link to all the tools I used in the video description below. We repeated the same process for the two center boards, which were 12-foot boards, and we made sure to space the ends of the boards 1/8 of an inch here as well. We then repeated the same process at the other end of the deck, wrapping the fascia boards around the corner, and the fascia boards were installed. With that done, we could start on the picture frame deck edging, which is really just a fancy way of saying the front boards wrap around the edge of the deck with a mitered end. So as you can see, leaving that 1/4 of an inch gap between the top edge of the fascia board and the decking really came back to bite me here, as I had a heck of a time keeping the board from tilting as I installed it. Also, this meant that the deck board would be unsupported in this area and would really be overhanging the joist by 1 3/4 inches, which is way more than the manufacturer allows for. And then I repeated the same frustrating process for the next picture frame board, till I finally threw in the towel and decided to fix the issue. The fix ended up being super simple. We just ripped 1/4 inch strips from the offcuts from the fascia boards and nailed them onto the top edge of the fascia boards. And since everything matches, the strip totally disappears, and this made installing the boards much, much easier and supported that overhang. Finally, after replacing that board, I could continue on down the deck with the picture frame edge, which was a lot easier now since these were just boards with square ends. Once all the picture frame boards were in, I could come back and lock them in place with hidden screws on the inside edge of the board. And to add these screws, I used the Craig deck jig system. After setting the stop collars and testing the jig on a scrap, I could go ahead and get these picture frame boards screwed to the joist, which went super quick with the jig. I continued on down the deck, attaching the boards to the joist until I got to my first set of butt joints that ended on a joist. With this jig, I could just use the angled guides on the jig to securely attach the boards to the joist with no doubling up of my joist and no routing grooves. I cut my first board to length, making sure to account for an 1/8 inch gap at either end of the board, and then I needed to go ahead and figure out the size of the row of decking against the house, since that would need to be installed prior to the center row of decking. Once again, I needed to leave a 1/4 of an inch gap between the deck boards, which was easy to set with the spacers, and I also needed a 1/4 of an inch gap between the house and the decking. After figuring out my measurement, I could rip the boards for the row against the house to width at the table saw. Once it was ripped to width, I cut the board to length at the miter saw, again cleaning up that factory end, and then I could slide the board into place under the door trim, or at least I tried to slide it into place. So in reality, this gap was way too tight, and I spent way too much time fighting this board into place. So after running into the exact same issue for the second board, I came up with a better method, which was just ripping a 45-degree bevel on the bottom edge of the board to give it more clearance, and then using my block plane to take down any problem areas, and after that the board slid into place super easy. With that last row of boards set into place but not attached to the joist yet, I could get the boards in the field installed. And once again, I spaced the end of the board 1/8 of an inch from the perpendicular board and spaced the boards 1/4 of an inch edge to edge using the spacers included with the deck jig. I repeated the process for the other 2 boards in this row, and then before attaching the last row of decking closest to the house, I got a little sidetracked with this retaining wall and paver patio project I've been working on. Needless to say, the deck looked a little different once I finally got to fastening those last few boards. I used the same 1/4 inch spacers to set the position of the boards, and I did need to add 1 row of face screws to these last boards to set them in place. And once those screws were added, I could call on the deck jig one last time to attach the other edge of the boards permanently. And with that, the composite decking was installed on this tiny deck on my tiny house. So before starting on the retaining wall, I had some major cleanup work to do, including filling in the trench leading from our main house, which is where our water, electrical, and Ethernet supplies run. After compacting, I could repeat the process a few more times until I had the trench completely filled in, and then I could go over the entire area with an excavator, which I rented from a local rental company, Hampton Equipment Rental. Once that was done, I got the tool that was the real star of this whole project setup, the rotary laser.
But yeah, like right here. Yeah, so
Eddie and I continued cleaning up the trench with some hand digging, and we also worked on widening it a bit since we needed a foot of clearance both in front of and behind the blocks, making for a 3-foot wide trench. With the trench for the front wall looking good, I could start roughing out the other walls with the excavator, and here's a quick overview of how our wall was going to look, with it running around the perimeter of this whole patio area. So we roughed out both perpendicular walls, making sure to check our depths with the grade rod frequently to make sure I wasn't digging too deep, and eventually we were close enough to add the first 6-inch layer of compacting base material. Eventually I had the trench brought up to our target height, and the following day Eddie and I could get to work getting the trench screeded to final level. And then we could finally start getting the locations of our first course of the cornerstone block laid out. To do this, we first set up a string line that corresponded with the back face of the first course of block, which needed to be 12 inches behind the face of the deck fascia. We repeated this process at the other end of the front wall, and then we could check our measurements along the length of the deck using a level as reference. After setting those 2 string lines, we used the 3-4-5 method to check that the lines were square, which by some miracle they were after the first attempt, and then we could get the first block, a corner block in this case, set in place. Once the corner block was in position, I could double check it for level and made any minor adjustments with a dead blow mallet. With that done, I could set the first wall block in place, which was no easy task considering these blocks weigh in at a whopping 75 pounds each. Thankfully, I was able to modify an inexpensive brick lifting tool I found on Amazon to work with these blocks, and I would not attempt to build a wall like this without some kind of tool like this. Once we got a good section of the front wall in place, we could prep for the second course by completely filling the cores of the blocks along with the area in front of and behind the first course with more of that ABC material, compacting the material after filling. After sweeping off any excess material from the surface of the first course, we could start on the second course of block, again starting in the corner. Next, I could set the wall block in place using those lugs on the bottom of the block to help set its position relative to the block in the previous course. Before setting the other wall block closest to the corner, I needed to knock off one of the lugs since there wasn't a spot for the lug on the corner block, and then I could set it in place, fine-tuning the position of the corner block to match. Anyway, I got the T fitting nicely, and then we cut off a short length of drain pipe to extend the T past the front face of the block, and once that was installed in the block, we could set it in place and continue working down the wall. So we added a second drainage outlet towards the left end of the front wall, making sure both pipes exited a good distance from the footings on the house, and then we got the perforated drain pipe attached to the T's. And then we could start backfilling the wall with the ABC material. After backfilling and compacting with the ABC, I came back with the 3/4 inch washed gravel and filled in the area behind the block as well as in the cores of the block. And this 3/4 inch gravel will help to lock each course of block together since the gravel can flow through each course into the previous course, and the gravel also adds a ton of weight to the wall, making it even stronger. And then we could start laying the third course of block, once again starting in the corner and once again alternating the position of the corner block to keep that running bond pattern going. So because of the way our yard slopes, it just wasn't necessary or economical to have this wall be the same depth around the entire perimeter, so the bottom course of the wall needed to be stepped up in areas. We could continue on with the topmost course until we got to the block which would span across this elevation change. And before adding this block, we needed to knock off one lug, since again it would be set directly onto the ABC material, and then we could just continue on with that course, treating it like a first course and knocking both lugs off. We continued on at the opposite end of the wall, making another level change and also turning an inside corner this time, which was nice as they don't require corner blocks. And we eventually got each end of the wall to where the final level change would be. But before laying those blocks, we went ahead and laid the fourth course in all of the areas of wall we had already set so that we could get that main area backfilled before boxing out the skid steer. Once we had the area filled as much as we could, we got those last sections of wall set, and these sections ended up only being one course high. We also had to do a lot of hand digging here as the locations I dug with the excavator were a little bit off. Finally, on day 7 of working on this project, we got the last blocks laid, which was a huge relief as I'd also managed to strain my pectoral minor during this process. While Eddie worked on adding the rest of the cap blocks at the front of the wall, I got to work wiring the hardscape lights which run around the perimeter of the walls. We repeated the process for this next section of wall, and that's where I threw in the towel for day 8, as my chest was killing me and I knew I was only going to make it worse working out there. Thankfully, Eddie soldiered on and was able to finish the rest of the cap blocks, and then I could wrap up the lighting install. And with that, we could call the retaining wall part of this project complete, which was a huge relief. And now we were ready to tackle the porcelain paver patio. I added these awesome outdoor speakers around our patio area so that we could be surrounded by music while hanging out in our backyard. And before covering up this whole area with the pavers and gravel, I needed to go ahead and get the speakers wired and make sure everything was working as expected. You can connect the lead to the amp inside the house and fire them up for the first time, and man, did they sound great. Once I had the speakers working, I could go ahead and get back to prepping for the pavers, starting by laying down some landscaping fabric. So this fire pit area won't have any pavers and will just be gravel, so we could go ahead and spread some of the gravel in that area to get it covered up, also burying the bottom part of that cherry bomb speaker while we were at it. Once that was done, we had our base layer dealt with, and now we could repeat the entire process all over again to get our final layer of sand added. Once again, we set our screed rails in place using the rotary laser and then filled the area with paver sand before screeding it smooth. And the one big difference here versus when you're installing concrete pavers is that we needed to pre-compact our sand layer and then screed it again before installing the porcelain pavers. And I designed this entire patio layout so we wouldn't have to cut any of the pavers, and this made the installation process a lot simpler. After setting the first 2 string lines, we used the 3-4-5 method to double check that our string lines were square, and once that was done, I could get the first paver dropped in place. And this was really a pretty huge moment considering how many weeks of work had led up to this moment. After setting the paver in place, I adjusted its position to line up perfectly with the string lines and then checked it for level, although it obviously wouldn't be level in the direction it was being sloped for drainage. I made any adjustments with a dead blow mallet, which also helped to set the paver into the bed of sand slightly, and then I could get the second paver added. This was pretty much the same process, lining it up with the string line, but I also needed to add some 1/4-inch spacers between the pavers to leave room for the polymeric sand, which I used to fill the joints after adding the pavers. From there, I continued on down the line, laying more pavers by hand, but very quickly I realized there had to be a better tool for this job, and as it turns out, there was. So I was able to rent one of these vacuum lifters, which hooks up to a standard air compressor and allows you to lift and place these tiles much more accurately. And if you're going to be installing large format porcelain pavers like this, which clock in at about 35 pounds each, I would highly recommend trying to find one of these, as it was a total game changer in this process of laying the pavers and allowed me to be a lot more accurate. With the vacuum lifter in action, we were able to get in a really good rhythm laying these pavers and had a pretty large section of them laid in no time. We went ahead and added some of this paver edging to wrap up the day. This was a pretty simple process of removing the excess sand from the edges with a trowel, placing the edges up against the edge of the pavers, and then pounding in the stakes with a hammer to hold the edging in place. Once I had a large enough section for 2 more pavers screeded, we went ahead and continued on setting more pavers, and I could also check this center row for level in both directions since it wasn't sloped. We continued working our way towards the other end of the patio, using those tile spacers to keep our spacing consistent. Once that was done, I continued laying more pavers, but I didn't lay pavers in that center row quite yet, leaving that area for last. So again, I wanted that center row to help blend that transition between the two slopes, and to accomplish this, I once again pulled out my custom screed board, which I could reference off of the edges of the pavers I had already laid. And with that, all of the pavers were in place, and the last thing we did to wrap up day 2 was to finish adding the rest of that paver edging to keep everything locked in place. Thankfully, I still had a 24-hour window with no rain on day 3, so I really needed to get that polymeric sand added next. First, I went around and inspected everything, tapping on all of the pavers with a dead blow mallet just to make sure they weren't wobbling around because they weren't set well enough. Adding this sand is kind of similar to grouting tile, and the joints between the pavers needed to be completely filled with it, and the best way to do this was to sweep the sand into the joints, making sure to sweep from multiple directions to evenly fill the joints. After filling the joints with sand initially, I came back and tapped on each of the pavers with a dead blow mallet to help the polymeric sand settle into the joints further, and then I repeated the process of sweeping the sand into the joints. Finally, with the pavers as clean as I could get them, I could water the sand, making sure to set my nozzle to the shower setting to keep from washing the sand out of the joints. Then I could step back and check out the pavers in all their glory with the sand added, and they looked awesome. Thankfully, the rain held out for about a day after adding the sand, and then I could wrap up the patio by spreading the gravel, which really helped tie everything together. And with that, after about 2 solid weeks of back-breaking work, I could officially call this patio and retaining wall project complete, at least for now.
So besides paint and some landscaping work, there was really only one thing left to do on the outside of the not-so-tiny house, and that was to get some gutters installed. Now typically this style of gutter is really only available to gutter professionals, since these lengths of gutters need to be run on site with a very specialized machine. That said, after looking around in my area here in Asheville, North Carolina, I found a company called DIY Guys Gutter Supply, who specializes in providing the seamless gutters needed for a DIYer. And this allowed me to use these seamless gutters on my installation. And it was kind of crazy to see a 49-foot length of gutter pop out of the back of a van. After the pieces were run, Eddie and I carried them to the backyard to get them prepped to be hung on the house. And generally speaking, you want to do as much of the work on your gutters as possible on the ground, since it's both easier and safer than trying to do the work up on ladders. The last thing to do before getting the gutters mounted to the house was to add the mounting brackets, as again, it's much easier to do this on the ground. And one end of these brackets hook under the rolled lip on the top front edge of the gutter, and the other end slips over the flat non-rolled edge. I could finally get the gutters mounted to the house, which was a pretty simple process. I started in the center, pushing the gutter up as high as possible against the drip edge, and then I drove in the mounting screw into the subfascia and the rafter tail. From there, I could work my way out from the middle using a level to check that the gutters were sloped for proper drainage. I could also use our subfascia as a bit of a reference point here, since it should be level as long as the rest of the house was built level. We had a pretty good rain the following day, so we could verify that our gutters were sloped properly, which thankfully they were, but you could also just use a hose to add some water towards the center of your gutters to make sure they're draining properly before moving on. And you really don't want a ton of standing water in your gutters, as the added weight could cause damage to them over time. Next, we could get the downspouts installed, starting with the elbow which points the downspouts towards the house. Next, I got the piece added to the elbow, making sure the uncrimped end on the new piece overlapped the crimped end on the elbow. Before attaching the downspout, I needed to go ahead and get these downspout bands attached to the corner trim, as they wrap around from the back of the downspout. Once that was done, I could get the pieces connected, making sure the downspout was centered on the corner trim, and then I attached the band to the downspout with more self-tapping screws. I repeated the process at the bottom of the downspout, making sure it was plumb, and with that, my downspout was installed. So the leaf guards were fairly simple to install. We just started at one end of the gutter and got the leaf guard attached with a few self-tapping screws, and I'll still need to clean off these leaf guards once or twice a year, especially in springtime when there's a ton of stuff falling from the trees, but these should definitely help to keep my gutters from clogging. We repeated the process down the rest of the gutters, cutting the last section to length, And once that was done, I could call this gutter installation complete. So before getting the tiny house insulated, I had a handful of items I needed to check off, and a lot of these had to be done prior to insulation due to the fact that I was adding soundproofing insulation to the interior walls. I could move on to the next item on my punch list, which was adding some low voltage boxes for the Ethernet cable, which will connect to the router in our main house, plus the speaker wire for the outdoor patio speakers. And since both of these cables are low voltage, I could run them into a low voltage box, which I'll add a brush plate to later. Next on the punch list was adding some additional framing for the shower niche. I also added some painter's tape across the opening after framing so the insulators wouldn't install insulation in this area. I also added spray foam to any spots that needed it, like around the exterior outlet boxes, around windows, and anywhere else I wanted to air seal. Once all that was done, I passed my final rough-in inspections, which was a huge relief so I could get the tiny house insulated. So as I mentioned in a previous video, I decided to go with closed cell spray foam insulation on the underside of the house. And the reason for this is closed cell spray foam not only insulates, it also air seals and moisture seals, both of which are extremely important with this type of pier and beam foundation. The next day, the insulators came back out to get the rock wool installed, and they did a great job and got this insulation installed in just over a day with only 2 guys working. They were super quick. And I used rock wool Comfort Bat R38 in the rafters, Comfort Bat R23 in the 2x6 exterior walls, and rock wool Safe and Sound soundproofing insulation in the interior walls to keep the sound transfer between the rooms to a minimum. And man, let me tell you, the difference between the space prior to insulation and afterwards was incredible. With that done, I could get the insulation inspection, which I passed with flying colors, and then we could move on to getting some drywall hung. And in case you missed it earlier in the series, the plan from the beginning has been to have a mix of drywall and finished plywood for the wall surfaces in this tiny house, with the drywall on the interior partition walls and plywood on the outer walls and ceiling. And because of this, we had a pretty simple drywall install since there weren't many corners or other odd bits to work with, and we already hung a little less than half of the drywall when we installed the mini split units earlier in this series. Finally, we installed drywall around the door opening leading into the master bedroom, as well as the bathroom ceiling off camera, and it was time for taping and mudding. And rather than try to do this myself, since I am pretty terrible at drywall finishing, I decided to hire my buddy Justin, who you might remember from my shop build series a few years ago. And Justin is a drywall wizard, and he makes this whole process look so much easier than it really is. Justin started the process by installing the metal corner bead around the corners, which thankfully we didn't have very many of. After adding the corner trim, Justin mixed up a batch of 45-minute mud to fill in any of Eddie and I's shoddy workmanship. Once that was done, he added a little water to some bucket mud to get it to the consistency he wanted, and then got to taping all of the seams.
Creamy.
All in all, Justin applied 4 coats of mud, stepping up to a larger joint knife after each coat to continue feathering those seams, and this is how the walls looked prior to sanding. And the surface was good enough to where he didn't really need to do much sanding at all, basically just a little hand sanding with a sanding block, and then we were ready for some paint. And I'm not quite sure on the final paint color yet, but Eddie and I could go ahead and roll on a couple coats of primer, sanding between coats to seal the drywall and mud, and it was definitely exciting to see the walls start to look finished. I started the waterproofing process by getting the shower pan installed. I used this foam shower pan system made by Prova, and I had already laid out where I wanted the shower curb in a previous video in this series, so all I needed to do at this point was cut the main pan pieces to length, which I did with a utility knife. With that, the shower pan was dry fit, so I could go ahead and dry fit the shower curb, which was also part of this Prova system. And the curb was made of the same type of foam, and I cut it to length with my miter saw, although a utility knife definitely would have worked here as well. Next, I added more thinset and used the notch side of the trowel to add the notch pattern. And these notches are designed to leave the amount of thinset you need on your substrate. With that done, I could get the shower pan set in place, and I really worked it into the thinset, and walking on the shower pan definitely made quick work of this. And after setting this first part of the pan, I pulled up one of the pieces just to check for good coverage, and as you can see, I had essentially 100% coverage, which means this pan is now very securely attached to the subfloor. Once that was done, I could repeat the process on the other half of the shower pan, also adding the smaller pieces that make up the area for the linear drain. With that done, I could get the linear drain set in place, and again, I used that connect tight coupling, so there wasn't any glue to deal with, thankfully.
With that, the shower pan was pretty much done, so I could move on to installing the curb, which also needed to be attached to the floor with more thinset. I switched back to the square notch trowel for this, and once I had the thinset spread, I could set the curb in place, again stepping on it to really set it in place. Now, as you can see, I didn't add enough thinset along this inside edge at first, so I went back and added a bit more and then finished working it into the thinset. And with that, the shower pan assembly was done, and after letting it dry overnight, I could get to work on waterproofing the walls. Thankfully, our framing was really nice on the wall and floor, so I was able to get right to installing the Prova board material I used on the walls. And these panels are made up of a waterproof foam core with a cement coating, so they're perfect for this type of bathroom waterproofing. And the panels are super lightweight and can be cut just like drywall by scoring one face, snapping the board along the cut line, and then cutting the other face to finish the cut. Next, I could get the panel attached to the wall, and attaching these pieces requires the use of these specialized screws and washers, along with this Prova adhesive sealant. Next, I could get the shower niche set in place, and this was a similar process of adding adhesive along the bottom edge, as well as to the studs, and then screwing it in place. And again, I left that 1/8 inch gap between the two pieces. And the only difference here was a few of these screws needed to span between two pieces based on how the framing was laid out. From there, I could just rinse and repeat to finish up this left wall, and then I repeated the process on the first 3 panels on the right wall before moving on to waterproofing the panels. To completely waterproof these panels, I went around and added that same Prova adhesive to all of the screws and washers, spreading the adhesive and making sure the entire area was covered. Once I was done installing the Prova board and the adhesive had a chance to dry, I decided to do kind of the ultimate test to check the shower pan for leaks, a flood test. To perform the flood test, I first plugged the drain using this drain plug, which is designed for this type of test, and then I added 10 gallons of water to the shower pan. After adding the water, I dipped a paint stirrer in the deepest part of the shower and then marked a line to indicate the original water level. Once that was done, I could wait and see if the water level dropped, and I ended up waiting about 36 hours before checking the level for the final time. We will see.
Many hours later.
Alright buddy, we're gonna check the level here, okay? Alright, let's not get in there because it's full of water. Alright, look. Do you think the water's to that line?
Yeah.
Look like it?
Yeah.
You know what that means?
Yeah.
It means my shower is not leaking. That's very good. Finally, I could pull the plug to drain the shower, but I forgot to check where the shower line ended since our sewer line isn't actually hooked up yet. Interesting.
Did it not go out?
It's not draining.
Didn't you say you were gonna check that?
I forgot to. So as it turns out, the plumbers had capped the end of the sewer line, so in order for the water to be able to drain, I had to cut off the capped end with 10 gallons of water spraying into my face, and that was not super fun.
Hey, the water line came out. Oh! Well, it worked.
It worked. After getting the thinset troweled out, I could set the first piece of Ditra in place and get it worked into the thinset, and a grout float works great for this. And you really want to work it in well, making sure that fleece backing on the Ditra is well adhered to the thinset. With that, I could get started with installing the tile, and I mixed up a batch of this Mapei uncoupling membrane mortar, which worked great for this floor tile installation since it was an unmodified mortar. And I used a 1/4 inch by 3/16 inch V-notch trowel to add the thinset, but I should mention that I ended up switching to a slightly larger notch pattern, a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch square notch trowel on the second day of installation, and I think that worked a lot better here. Anyway, after troweling, I set the first piece of mosaic in place, and I added 3/16 inch wedge spacers where the sheet met up with the wall to allow room for expansion and contraction, and I also added a few 1/8 inch spacers to the tiles set in the mosaic mat to space them a little more consistently. After getting that sheet set in place, I ran into my first piece that needed to be cut around the linear drain. So I marked where my cuts needed to be and then headed over to the tile saw to make the cut. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite complete the cut with the tile saw because of the round blade on the saw, so I headed outside to finish the cut with my angle grinder and a diamond cutting wheel. And when making these more tricky cuts with the angle grinder on these mosaic sheets, I found that just removing the individual piece from the mosaic sheet made cutting them a lot easier, and in no time, I had the corner cut cleaned up. After cutting, I tested the piece around the linear drain and it seemed to fit well, so I moved on with getting those pieces set in place with more wedges and spacers.
From there, it was really just rinse and repeat to tile the rest of the shower pan, and my biggest recommendation here would be to use more spacers than you think you need. These smaller mosaic tiles really have the tendency to move around, even with the mesh backing, if they're not kept in place with spacers. Case in point, I ended up kind of scrunching up some of these tiles when I test fit the drain cover about halfway through installing the shower tiles, and I had to frantically readjust these tiles after figuring out what had happened, which was pretty tricky since the thin set was starting to set up. Before mixing up the next batch of thin set, I decided to go ahead and dry fit the majority of the tiles I needed to finish off the shower pan area, as well as the pieces for the curb. And I would personally recommend dry fitting as many of your tiles as possible if you're newer to tile work like I am, especially if you're working by yourself. Because once that thin set is mixed up, you're working against the clock, and I find myself a lot less stressed and end up with a much better result if I pre-cut the pieces, and that was definitely the case here as well. Anyway, once that was done, I could finally get the thin set mixed up and get to laying tile, which went really smoothly since most of my pieces were pre-cut. Adding the tiles to the inside face of the curb was a little tricky since I had to contend with the sloped shower pan, but thankfully the slope wasn't very severe and I could make minor adjustments by switching between a 1/16 of an inch and an 1/8 inch spacer here. I repeated the process installing the tiles on the outer face of the curb, and once that was done, I could really start moving since there were mostly full mosaic sheets here. And I basically just worked my way out towards the doorway since I couldn't step on these tiles after setting them, and eventually got to the point where I needed to install the transition strip. To do this, I added thin set to that area and then set the strip into the thin set, using the edge of the Ditra as a reference point to get it set correctly. On the final mosaic piece, I inch monstered myself and cut the sheet 1 inch too short, so I had to recut it, and I was starting to kind of get into panic mode at this point since the thin set I had already laid was drying out a bit, and to help combat this, I back buttered the entire mosaic sheet, but as you can see, this caused a ridiculous amount of squeeze out between the tiles, which was a real pain to clean up. Anyway, I got that piece fit, and then it was on to the home stretch, fitting those last 4 slivers, which, as I mentioned, were pretty darn annoying. Thankfully, I just took my time here and back buttered the pieces before installing them, and eventually got the pieces fitting really nicely before taking a step back and taking a look at my work. And I was really happy with how the floor tile was looking at this point. To apply the grout, I used a grout float and worked the grout into the joints, making sure to work it in from multiple directions to ensure it completely filled the joints. I worked in small, manageable sections, and once I had all the joints filled, I cleaned up the bulk of the excess grout before moving on to the next section. And wiping off the excess grout requires a little bit of care, as you don't want to wipe away too much grout from your joints, and also if your sponge is too wet, you risk washing the color out of your grout. And I just continued wiping away the excess grout until I was satisfied with how the surface was looking, and then I could move on to grouting the rest of the floor. And the trickiest part of this process was trying to grout an area just large enough so I could still reach it all without stepping on wet grout, which you really don't want to do. Overall, the process went smoothly though, and this 1 10-pound bag of grout ended up being perfect for this floor with just a tiny bit left over at the end. Once that was done, I could set the first tile in place and made sure to really press it into place and kind of wiggle it back and forth to make sure it was set in the mortar bed. I repeated the same process for the 2 tiles along the edge of this wall, and you'll notice that I also used a tile leveling system here, which I would highly recommend when working with tiles this large. And so these white spacers slide under the back edge of the previous tile, and after setting the next tile in place, I could add these wedges with the included tool to make sure the faces of the tiles were aligned. And then I could move on to the second row, which was the exact same process as the first row. I repeated the same process on the next row, which ended up being even trickier since I had to notch the tile around both the niche and the window, and I did actually end up breaking one of these tiles in half when making this cut. I almost made a pretty major error on this second to last row, and rather than cutting 2 pieces for each side of the window, I cut 1 piece, which would have ruined the whole joint pattern I was going for, but thankfully I realized this before the thin set setup and yanked those tiles off the wall, but I decided to just move on to the adjoining wall since our thin set was really setting up at this point. So for the most part, this was just more of the same process, but I should mention that I ended up cutting this column of tiles down by an amount equal to the width of the tile on the adjoining wall, if that makes sense. Basically, so it would look like these tiles wrapped around that corner. And we started day 2 by cleaning up all of the tile leveling wedges and removing any excess thin set from between the tiles. And these tile leveling spacers are designed to just break off, leaving the piece behind the tiles so you can remove the piece from the grout joints. And the wedges are reusable, so we cleaned off any excess thin set from those as well. And after removing all of the spacers, we came back with a grout saw to clean up any excess thin set from the joints.
Next, I could temporarily fit the tile and mark where I needed to notch it around the window, but this time I could thankfully use the new saw to help with this cut. So as with the Craftsman saw, I made the cross cuts first, but the real ace up this DeWalt saw sleeve was the plunge functionality, which allowed me to start this rip cut in the middle of the tile. And all that was left to do after that was to tidy up the corners with the angle grinder, and then I could test fit the tile, which, as expected, fit just about perfectly. We got the last row installed and then moved along, wrapping up the tile on the leftmost wall, which was a breeze since we only had the shower head pipe to work around. With that done, we finished up most of the tile on that wall, and that's where we called it a day. The following day, I got the door hung and the PVC trim installed off camera, and I'll be doing an entire video on installing doors later on in this series, so stay tuned for that. Once that was done, I took a few measurements for the row of tile to the left of the door, and then we could get this last section of wall tile knocked out, which was really a breeze at this point. Once the floor tile was installed, I could get the last bits of wall tile prepped, including the pieces in the shower niche and window, and the bottom row. I repeated the process for the two sides and the top of the window, cutting the sides so the top piece would be supported by the side pieces during installation. And all in all, dry fitting the pieces for the bottom row, the window, and the shower niche was a multiple hour process. And once that was finally done, I could get the floor covered up with some ram board so I didn't get thin set all over it while installing these pieces. With that done, I could get my last bag of thin set mixed up, thankfully, and get to installing, starting with the window. I installed the bottom pieces first, adding the Schluter Rondeck and then the tile, and I made sure to angle the tile ever so slightly towards the shower so that water would run off the tile rather than pooling on the surface, and I verified this with my level. Next, I installed the left side pieces, and then I could get the top piece added. And once again, the top piece rested on the side pieces so that it wouldn't fall down while the thin set was setting up. After getting the top piece set in place, I got the right pieces set really quickly, hoping that the top piece wouldn't fall off, and thankfully it didn't. And I added wedges and spacers where needed just to keep everything in place while the thin set set up, and wiped off any excess thin set with a damp sponge before repeating the whole process on the shower niche. And the shower niche was a royal pain since I wanted to keep those grout lines aligned with the rest of the wall tiles, and this required a lot of adjusting and fitting, which just took forever, even with the pieces mostly pre-cut. I got the pieces fitting well eventually, and then I could move on to the bottom row, which was pretty simple compared to the window and the niche. The very last piece to install was this shower curb, which is a solid surface material designed for this kind of application. And it was easy to cut and fit, and I installed it with more thin set, once again angling it ever so slightly towards the shower so water would run off into the shower. With that, I could do a little cleanup work and finally call the tile setting complete in this bathroom, which was a huge relief. I applied the grout from the top of the wall down, working my way around the room and then wiping off any excess from those top rows before moving lower on the walls. And then once that was done, I could finally move on to caulking all of the places where the two planes of the tile met up. And I got all of the white silicone added on the walls before uncovering the floors, and then I could switch to a gray silicone that matched the grout on the floor. And I caulked the joints between the wall and the floor, the curb and the floor, and the underside of the curb sill and the curb tile. And once that was done, I could finally call the tile installation in this bathroom complete. All right, so now that all of the drawers and drawer fronts are in and working really well, love these undermount soft close slides there. So nice. I need to go ahead and get this top cleaned up. Obviously, I still have all of this excess epoxy up here. I need to get it trimmed to final size. And I also need to cut the opening in the middle here for the vessel sink that I'm gonna be using. Rather do that now prior to finishing, so then if anything gets screwed up, it can be fixed a lot more easily than if this thing had finish on it. So let's go ahead and get all of this cleaned up and get to work on that. So as you can see, I got the Vanity brought back here to the not so tiny house and have started the process of getting it installed. I used about 4 screws in total. I used 3-inch long screws since I'm going through 3/4 inch plywood, 3/8 inch tile, a bed of thin set, and then the 1/2 inch foam wallboard. So actually there is just an ever slight bow right here. So what I'm gonna do, that had a little clamping pressure. All right, so the very last thing I want to do on this vanity, besides a little caulking work and some other boring cleanup, is get these LED strips installed on the underside. So my battery bank is inside charging right now, so it did come with a little power supply, so I'm just gonna plug it in temporarily, see what it looks like. Oh yes, that is sweet. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. Next, I located where either end of the rail needed to be mounted on the wall so I could get the brackets attached, and I made sure to double and triple check my measurements here, as the last thing I wanted to do was drill a hole in the wrong location on my freshly installed tile walls. I repeated the process on the bracket on the other wall, and then I could unthread the brass plates from the bracket, slide the brackets onto the rail, and then reattach the brackets to the plates to get the rail mounted. Next, I could get the fixed glass panel attached temporarily so I could locate the mounting clip and door guide on the curb. Next, I could get the sliding door installed, starting by adding another seal strip to the edge where it would meet the wall, then installing the rollers, then finally hanging the door on the rail. And the rollers have a built-in mechanism for making fine height adjustments, and this was super helpful for getting both panels aligned and getting the door nice and level. And the shower door was installed, and I think it not only looks great, but it's super easy to use. I got the shower trim installed next, which was super simple, even though this wasn't something I had done before, and it's amazing how much more finished the shower looks with the trim kit in. With that done, it was on to the thing I'd honestly kind of been avoiding, installing the wall-hung toilet and bidet seat. And considering I've never worked on this kind of toilet system, this was a pretty intimidating process, and it was made worse by the fact that this toilet and bidet seat are made by Duravit, while the wall-hung toilet frame is made by Geberit. So figuring out how to make these two systems work together required way more research than I really anticipated, but after a few hours poring over various manuals, a few support phone calls, and ordering about half a dozen incorrect parts and pieces, I finally figured it out. Next, all that was left to do was to lift the toilet onto the mounting rods, slide in the plumbing pipes, and then tighten the bolts on the underside of the toilet to hold it in place. Or at least that's how it was supposed to work.
God dang it. Come on. Dude, this is not working. Oh my God. Dude. What in the... Why are you still...
I struggled with this toilet for about half an hour, thinking I was doing something wrong when in reality I just hadn't cut the pipes quite short enough so the toilet wouldn't sit flush against the wall. Also, this toilet weighs almost 70 pounds and I was completely shot after wrestling with it for 30 minutes. Finally, after I took a step back and let my rage subside, I figured out the problem, and after trimming about another 1/4 inch off the pipes, I got the toilet mounted successfully. Whew. Next, I got the water line and the electrical connections attached to the underside of the seat, and then once that was done, I could tuck all the excess into the toilet and attach the seat to the bracket. So since the toilet tank is hidden in the wall, this area where the actuator plate will be installed functions as the access panel to all the plumbing. And I needed to get this extra part connected to route the water supply, which is controlled by the blue knob in the top left corner, to both the bidet seat and the tank itself. Once those connections were made, I could also break away the excess material from this rough-in box, which again can be broken to match your wall thickness. With that done, I ran outside to turn on the water, which was hooked up a week or so ago along with the sewer line, and both of those inspections passed, thankfully, so I can finally fill in those trenches and start cleaning up the outside of the tiny house here soon. With the water on, I could open up the water supply valve and check for any leaks, which thankfully there weren't any of, and then I could try flushing the toilet for the first time, which was a very momentous occasion, and thankfully this seemed to work great with, again, no leaks. Next, I got the actuator plate mounted, which basically just covers up the rough-in opening and gives you some nice looking buttons to press. Once that was installed, I got the batteries installed in the remote and tested it out. And yes, this bidet seat is remote controlled. So as you can see, the lid and seat open and close remotely, and you can also adjust the bidet's spray pattern, water pressure, and temperature, as well as the temperature of the seat itself, and the fan, which dries you off after using the bidet. Finally, I got the switch plate installed, which I really should have done a long time ago, and I also went ahead and labeled the switch for the bath fan since it has a switch for the light, the fan, and the heater, which can be kind of confusing. With that, I could finally call this bathroom done. Let me tell you, this project has been a struggle to get through, and you might have noticed I've put out a few less videos than normal because of it. And I started the process of waterproofing the bathroom on July 1st, so that was about 3 months ago. And I thought this project would never end. There were moments where I really wanted to throw in the towel and where I felt just completely out of my element, but I've got to say I am incredibly proud of the result. This bathroom turned out absolutely gorgeous in my opinion, and I am so excited to see the rest of the interior of the tiny house come together. So once the weather stripping was in, we could finally start hanging some plywood, and we started by mounting a straight board flush with the laser line on this gable end wall. Next, I could cut a piece of length with the track saw, and I used the stops on the ACS to make sure the panel was square to the track, which is a really nice feature with this kind of table setup. Next, I set up a vertical line with the laser so we could position the edge of the panel centered on the studs. And this first board obviously needed to be cut around this window opening, so we got the piece positioned, and then I could mark the location of the window by tracing on the back face of the panel. To cut the opening, I headed back to the cut station and laid down a few bench cookies so I could cut the opening with my jigsaw without cutting into my platform. Next, we could pre-drill, countersink, and pre-drive the screws in these panels. And to drill the holes, we used the jig I showed in last week's video and used a self-centering drill bit to basically mark the hole locations. We could then countersink the holes with my all-time favorite countersink bit, which has the absolute must-have feature of this non-mar depth stop. Once the screws were in, I could get the first piece mounted on the wall, and I made sure the top of the panel was tight against our alignment board and the edge of the panel was lined up with my laser line, and then I could drive in all the screws, making sure not to overdrive them, just to allow a little bit of room for adjustment later on. To set the reveal between the panels, we used paint stir sticks as our spacers. And I picked up this tip from my buddy Mike from Modern Builds, and these paint stirrers work great as spacers since they're a consistent 1/8 inch thick and they're rough enough so that they don't slip out as easily as something like plastic would. We repeated the process at the other end, and with that, our first row was installed. Next, we could fill in the top row, which was a little tricky since it had to be cut to fit the roof line. Thankfully, we didn't have to get this absolutely perfect since the ceiling panels would cover up 1/2 inch of space. So with that, it was easy enough to measure and then cut to those measurements with the track saw. And we did use the drilling jig on these pieces as well, but instead of referencing off of the top edge like we did with the other panels, we referenced off of the bottom edge just to keep a nice consistent screw spacing. Finally, I could install the piece using more paint stirrers as spacers and lining up the edge with my laser line. I repeated the process for the other panels, and thankfully I was able to get these pieces out of the offcuts from the ceiling panels, which I'll show next. It was really just rinse and repeat for the ceiling panels, and I was so glad to finally get this insulation covered up, as I've been bumping into it for months and getting itchy, and that is just super annoying. Next, I used my laser measure to take a measurement for the length of the trim and then cut the trim to length with, you guessed it, the ACS. And if you watched last week's video, you'll know that my plan was to attach this trim with pocket screws. So next I could pre-drive a few 2.5 inch pocket screws before moving the board into place. We got the trim positioned, making sure it was spaced evenly at either end because I had the same kind of reveal there, and then I could drive in the pocket screws, making sure to hold the trim tight to the alignment board. Now, this wall was a bit of a different story since I had obviously this giant sliding door to deal with. And because this door was actually sized for 2x4 framing instead of 2x6 framing, which we have here, I had to pack out the area for the extension jambs, and these little scraps of this plywood were perfect for this. And luckily there was a huge pile of these 2-inch offcuts from the wall panels since we cut those to length, and I got them tacked in place with a narrow crown stapler. And after drilling, countersinking, and pre-driving the screws, I could get the first piece installed, which went really smoothly. I continued on down the wall installing more of these small pieces, and then I was in the home stretch with these last few larger pieces. And this left panel went in easily enough, but we really struggled on this panel kind of close to the door here. And after getting it fitting perfectly, spending like 20 minutes cutting this thing to size, we finally noticed that our screw pattern didn't line up since the ceiling height changed in this hallway, so I couldn't really use my jig. So I had to scrap that board and recut it, which was super frustrating, and I actually called it a day at that point. The next day I started fresh and got the new piece fit and installed and could move on to the last two pieces around that entry door, which were really easy since there will be trim to cover the edges around that door opening. The very last thing to do for the installation of the panels themselves was to add some more screws here around the edges of this big door opening, and my wife and her dad showed up right as I was installing these, and let me tell you, my wife and I were pretty excited to have all of these plywood pieces installed. And to clean these up, I got a flush trim bit installed on my trim router and went around the inside edges of the window openings. This was pretty stressful routing, as any big screw up here would require me to replace the entire panel, since there isn't going to be any trim to mask those areas around these windows. Thankfully though, the routing went pretty smoothly, and with a little bit of sanding, I should be good to go. And then I could finally vacuum up all the sawdust we generated by cutting this plywood before stepping back to admire our work. And overall, this plywood installation honestly was probably one of my least favorite parts of this build so far, a close second to installing all the tile in the bathroom. But I am so happy with the way the inside of the tiny house is looking with these walls installed, especially this main room. It's just super bright and airy with the vaulted ceilings. It's looking awesome.
So first things first, I checked the ceiling in this area for level, since the cabinets would be butting right into the ceiling, and it was pretty close to dead on, so that simplified things a bit. Next, I marked out the locations of the studs on the wall and also measured out the dimensions to the studs from the left corner. I then transferred those measurements to the back of the first cabinet, making marks about 2 inches from the top and bottom edges of the cabinet at each stud location. I could then drill through the back of these marks, drilling through to the inside of the cabinet. Next, I flipped the cabinet over and countersunk the holes from the inside with this countersink bit, which is specifically designed for the screws I'm using to install these cabinets. And these 2.5-inch screws have a really large head, which creates a ton of holding power, and they can easily be covered up with some peel and stick caps, which I'll show a little later, and this makes for a super clean looking install. We checked the fit one more time and it was looking good, so we could finally get the cabinet attached to the wall permanently, once again shimming where we needed to get the cabinet level and plumb. Once all that cutting was done, we test fit the cabinet and everything looked good, so I roughly marked where I needed to cut down the duct since I had left it long when installing it earlier. Once everything was flush, I clamped the cabinets together, and then I could add screws to hold the front edges together permanently. And I pre-drilled and countersunk the holes and then drove in 1.25-inch screws since my cabinets have 3/4-inch thick sides. The last cabinet to install was this little 12-inch wide unit, which creates the opening for both the microwave and the fridge. And we repeated the same process of clamping the front edges, only this time I added the screws from above. Also, I realized this is a bit of a funky cabinet layout compared to your typical upper cabinets, and that was because I built these specifically for this kitchen layout and for this hardware. And your cabinets might look a little different, but the basics of installing them will be roughly the same. With that done, we could get the microwave lifted into place and set on the bracket, and then I could attach the microwave to the cabinet from above using the included screws. And I didn't have the transition piece to get the microwave attached to the ductwork yet, so we called it there for the microwave install, and I went ahead and got the doors reattached so I could take in the upper cabinets in all their glory, and I am pretty excited with how they turned out. Next, it was onto the base cabinets, and the first thing I needed to do was install a ledger board onto which the base cabinets will be installed. Once that was done, I could go ahead and adjust the leveling feet to get the front corner of the cabinet plumb, and I also marked the stud locations while I was at it. Next, I shimmed the back right edge of the cabinet until the front edge was lined up with my laser line, and then I could drive in a few screws to attach the cabinet to the wall. I repeated the same process as the upper cabinets to get the front edges of these two cabinets attached, clamping them, pre-drilling and countersinking holes, and then driving in 1.25-inch screws, and then I got the cabinet leveled and shimmed before attaching it to the wall. I could then repeat the exact same process for the next two base cabinets, and of course my camera decided to go out of focus just as I started this time lapse, so apologies there. So once the wall oven cabinet was installed, I could finally get the sweet Samsung wall oven unboxed to make sure it fit in the cabinet, and unfortunately things didn't go quite as planned here. So as you can see, this unit suffered some major damage at some point during the shipping process, and I was still able to verify the fit with this mangled unit, but it was a real bummer to find this out when I was finally getting these units installed in the kitchen after they've been sitting in my crawl space for months.
The last cabinet outside of the island was this 3-drawer base next to the wall oven cabinet, and it was simple enough to install, although I did need to drill the holes for the electrical for the wall oven and cooktop here. And I once again attached the front edges of the cabinets using 1¼ inch screws, and then I could get the cabinet screwed to the studs and finally get the drawers reinstalled. And while I was in this area, I went ahead and got a hole drilled in the sink base for the dishwasher plumbing and power, and then got the Samsung Small Spaces dishwasher moved into place. Next, I attached another length of low voltage wire to the line I had just run, as I needed to run this wire all the way around these base cabinets and up the wall to the upper cabinets. And thankfully, running this wire behind the fridge worked perfectly, as I was initially thinking I'd have to run this cable behind the drywall, which would have been a total pain. From there, I could spend some time getting all of the Aventos hinges wired up in the upper cabinets, doing my best to keep the cables nice and tidy, and I also programmed the collision settings on this rightmost cabinet, as I didn't want the upper door opening into the lower door while it was already open. Once all that was done, I could try out these touch-to-open cabinets for the first time in the tiny house, and needless to say, it was pretty exciting. From there, I was really in the home stretch, and the next thing to get installed was this finished in panel on this rightmost cabinet. And as you can see, this panel not only gives the cabinet a much nicer look, but it'll also allow me to cover up the rough edges of the flooring that I'll be installing later without adding additional trim. And I can do this by removing the panel temporarily during the flooring installation. Once the in panel was on, I could get the toe kicks set in place, and I just set them in place for now without adding the clips which attach to these leveling feet. The last thing to do was add these peel and stick caps over the screws in the upper cabinets, and I painted these caps with the same paint so that they match perfectly. They really help to hide the screw heads, and they all but disappear once the caps are on. And with that done, I could call this cabinet installation a wrap. I decided to go ahead and start my installation 2 rows out so we could run our first installed row the full length of the tiny house from end to end to avoid cutting around the door framing. So I marked a point 3 3/4 plus 5 or 8 3/4 of an inch from the wall. We marked the same 8 3/4 of an inch location at the other end of the tiny house and then snapped a chalk line between our 2 points, which gave us a nice straight reference line for the first row. And by we, I mean me and the Perkins Builder Brothers crew who came out to help with this flooring install. To install the flooring, we used kind of a belt and suspenders approach and used a combination of flooring adhesive and flooring staples, and this is called glue assist installation. We got the first few pieces of flooring set in place, spacing the end of the first board off the wall by about 1/4 inch for expansion, and making sure to line up the long edge of the boards with our chalk line, and the flooring tape really helped to keep the pieces from sliding around prior to nailing. For nailing the floor, we used this cordless flooring stapler with 1¼ inch staples, and it was great not having to drag around air hoses, which are magnets for flooring adhesive. From there, we continued on down the first row, and this battery-powered caulk gun was another great tool for this type of work, as we went through a good bit of adhesive here. We started the second row with another board with the tongue cut off, and as you can see, we moved to 2 beads of adhesive from this row on, as recommended by the folks at Titebond. To help seat the boards and close up the joints, we used a combination of a bunch of tools, but this giant tapping block was probably our favorite. And the tapping block was heavy enough so you really didn't need a mallet, and it just felt comfortable ergonomically. We just kept installing more rows, and before we knew it, we had gotten to the opposite wall in the hallway, so we needed to switch tactics for nailing the boards. The flooring stapler wouldn't fit in this situation, so we instead brad nailed the flooring down, nailing through the tongue so the nails were hidden. We also got to the first area where we needed to notch a board, and Eric and Jason were busy making a reel illustrating the fact that you shouldn't take measurements for these kind of cuts.
No.
Instead, you can just mark the board in place, which pretty much guarantees a more accurate cut. I used a jigsaw to make the cut, and this admittedly was not my best work.
You made that look amazing.
Yeah, that was my worst cut ever.
It'll all be hidden under your door casing.
Yeah.
So it's fine.
No big.
Lesson right there.
Thankfully, the board fit fine, and we used another tool, a pull bar in this case, to help pull the board tight. As we got closer and closer to the wall, pulling the flooring together got more and more challenging, and I pulled out yet another tool to help us in this situation, this flooring jack. This tool is pretty expensive and maybe isn't 100% necessary, but it really comes in handy when getting to your final rows of flooring.
So good that works, man. It's fantastic, isn't it? We did a lot of floors without one of these, and I always wondered how the real flooring guys got all the rows as tight as all the field right at the edge.
Yep.
And we thought we were doing something wrong. We just didn't have one of those, and they did.
You know where I saw that tool?
No.
Your video. Perkins Builder Brothers.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
We love it. PBB.
Anyway, from there we got into a really good rhythm and got most of the master bedroom knocked out in no time, so we could move to the guest bedroom from there. The last piece in this row was yet another tricky one since it had to be squeezed into place, but by far the most tricky piece in probably the whole house was this one right outside of the bathroom. So when I installed the tile in the bathroom, I had used this Schluter reducer strip, which the flooring should have been able to fit under, but unfortunately there was just too much thin set interfering.
What try is this here?
This is probably number 4, I would guess.
So you gotta go under that.
Yeah, I think what I need to do though, is like get a flat head, I need to slide it.
I think just nail it.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think it's good.
That's looking pretty good considering you've been working on it for a half hour.
One piece, man.
Well, I think you're on the right move here. Just keep planing it down.
Yeah, man.
After a whole lot of fitting and even some hand planing, I finally got it fit, and of course my camera decided to focus on my elbow instead of me nailing it in place, but as you can see, it ended up looking great in the end. And while Eric and I had been working on these tricky pieces, the rest of the guys had gotten the guest bedroom wrapped up, and we finished up day one by installing a few more rows out in the living area and cleaning up the area around the big sliding door to prep for installing flooring there the next day. We started day 2 with Eric entertaining us, trying to show us how to properly load the sausage gun.
Reload process of the sausage caulk machine here. So first,
Can't say sausage caulk.
Yeah. Get that off of there, the tip, and then to get rid of it, you just pump it out, and that's
Boom.
That's all that's left of the. This is what I started with.
Minimal waste.
And then we just reload. And this is where it gets messy for me so far. Is just cut the little tip off, but it ends up just getting all over me like that.
Oh.
Basically. I don't know if there's a better way to do this.
Sharper knife. Oh my gosh. Oh wow. Oh wow.
Okay.
The damn tube's gonna be in the trash.
Hey, can you clean my knife off for me?
Jesus, man.
That can't be the way to do it.
No, it's definitely not. The other
tip.
Just all the glue. Yeah.
And we're ready to go. Now the problem we've been having is that when we're done, for some reason, this is glued to the rest of the housing of the.
It's a mystery.
I'm not really sure what's happening there. But I'm gonna go make a peanut butter sandwich.
Yeah, that's good.
To get this last strip tight, Eric pulled out his chisel since the rest of the crew was using the other tools, and it just goes to show you can do this kind of work with simpler tools if that's all you've got. And we generally try to leave a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch gap between these last rows and the wall, and that gap will allow the flooring to expand and contract seasonally, although I don't really expect this floor to expand much considering it's both glued and stapled in place. From there, we wrapped up the flooring throughout the kitchen, which was pretty simple since the toe kick will hide the cut-ins of those boards, and with that, the flooring was installed. And all in all, it only took us about a day and a half to install this flooring, and I think it looks great in this finished space. So the last thing to build out in the not-so-tiny house kitchen was the island, which would serve as both a prep surface as well as the main dining surface in the tiny house. And to further complicate things, I also decided to install an under-counter ice maker in the island. Anyway, because of the water supply line and drain requirements for the ice maker, I ended up needing to frame out a small wall, sometimes called a pony wall, to house the plumbing and electrical, and I started by building the wall. Next, I got the wall positioned, pulling measurements off of the other walls in the house to make sure it was parallel, and then I screwed it to the joist below with 3-inch screws to lock the wall in place. Installing the drywall was easy enough, although the thickness of the Motobox mounting brackets caused the drywall to bow out a good bit and even break in one spot, and this all caused some issues later on, which you'll see. I also installed a GFCI outlet here due to its proximity to the water supply. Once the outlet was in, I snapped the cover rings onto the motor boxes, and then I could get back to drilling the hole for the pop-up outlet. Once that was drilled, I routed the Romex for the outlet up through the hole and stapled it to the stud to secure it. So I needed to cover both sides and the back of the island, and I wanted to do it without adding any unnecessary trim to keep this kind of clean, modern look going. So this was a bit of a project in and of itself. I painted these panels just like the rest of the cabinets, and then fast forward a few weeks, I was ready to assemble the panels into one unit once everything was in the tiny house without having to try and move the island panels already assembled. I started the assembly by sliding the connectors into the slots in the panels, and then I laid one of the panels on the floor. I added a bead of CA glue as my adhesive of choice, as wood glue wouldn't have bonded to the painted surfaces that well, and then I snapped the back panel into place. With all the panels assembled, I could slide them into place around the pony wall, and thankfully they fit perfectly. Next, I got the whole assembly shimmed up so it was flush with the top of the pony wall, since the flooring will run under these panels, and also made sure everything was level and plumb while I was at it. To keep the countersink bit from scuffing up the paint, I added some painter's tape, and then once the holes were pre-drilled, I added the screws. I repeated the same steps to add 3 more screws at the bottom of the back panel. Once all that was done, I could reinstall the drawers and get them adjusted. About a month later, the guys came back with the finished countertops to get them installed. And the sink opening was cut to the factory since those edges needed to be polished and rounded since they'd be exposed in the finished installation. And the installer measured for the hole for the pop-up outlet in the countertop before they brought the piece in. And once that piece was in, they got to work gluing the 2 sections of countertop together. The installer continued making minor adjustments from there and removing any excess adhesive until he was satisfied, and then they could get the sink mounted. And they were able to hold it in position with the combination of a clamp and a level, which is another great trick.
Pro move right there. I've installed the sink before and I did not do it that way.
Once the sink was positioned where he wanted it, he got the mounting clips installed, and these hold the sink in place permanently, and then he could remove the excess silicone, spraying it down with alcohol first to help keep it from sticking to his fingers. Yet another good pro tip. Finally, he could drill the holes for the faucet and disposal push button, and with that, the main countertops were done. And the only work to do on the island top was to drill the hole for the pop-up outlet, which was pretty simple after laying out the location. Once that was done, the installers caulked where the countertops met up with the cabinets, which both seals the joints to keep water from running between the countertop and the cabinets, but also keeps the countertop in place. And once that was done, the countertops were installed. I've got a lot of work to get done this week because my parents are coming into town this weekend. I've been telling them for the last month or so that they would be able to stay in the tiny house when they come visit. So not gonna get the tiny house done this week, but I'm gonna get it livable, or at least that's the goal. So the Birkins guys are showing up here in a couple minutes to help with the doors and trim inside. So I'll check back in once they get here. The first thing to get knocked out on day 1 was installing the trim and doors in the space, since we had just wrapped up installing the flooring. For the baseboards on the plywood walls, I decided to just keep things simple and ripped strips of the leftover pre-finished plywood to use as the baseboard. After getting the plywood baseboard installed, we needed to add the trim where the 2 vaulted ceiling panels met up. And before installing those pieces, I went ahead and blacked out the ceiling fan boxes with some black spray paint, which I figured would look a lot better since the lights and ceiling fans are also black. Once that was done, we could get the trim pieces cut. So to make these trim pieces, we ripped a bevel on the back edges of the plywood strips, and this would help the trim pieces meet up cleanly with the angled ceiling panels. And this was a bit of a tricky cut on the table saw, but we ended up with exactly what we needed for this ceiling trim after ripping. Before getting the white baseboard installed, we needed to go ahead and install the other 2 doors in the tiny house. And we started by adding some shims to the hinge side on the rough opening to plumb that side of the door opening.
You're wasting my shims, man.
This side's a little low.
Once that was done, we slid the door assembly into the opening and double checked the hinge side for plumb before attaching it to the wall with 2.5-inch screws through the hinge plates. Next, we leveled the top of the door frame by shimming the handle side of the door frame.
I mean, that's good.
And once that was looking good, we nailed it in place.
That looks pretty good.
We left about a 1/4 inch reveal between the trim and the door jamb and nailed it in place around the door. And in retrospect, I wasn't super impressed with the quality of these split jamb doors, but they were all I could get in a timely manner in the style I wanted. So we made them work, but I probably wouldn't recommend them if you're looking for a nice door. So now that those doors and most of the trim is installed, we can go ahead and get started on some painting work. This is gonna be pretty time consuming because we gotta paint the doors themselves, the door jambs, which are raw wood, as well as the window jambs and window frames, which are also raw wood. So we're gonna have a lot of paint dry time between the primer and the multiple coats of paint. So let's go ahead and get started on that. To kick off day 3, I repeated the sanding process on the window frames as the water-based primer raised the grain on the windows and doors, and I also opened the windows to let the tiny house air out a little bit. Nate got the first coat of paint on the doors while I continued caulking, and in case you're wondering, this color is Sherwin-Williams Cyberspace, and I think it looks awesome on these doors. We continued painting for the rest of day 3, and we could come back for day 4 to start the mad dash of getting the house put back together. I started by getting the doors hung back up, and then I could get the handles installed, which was a pretty simple process. Next, I could get the window opening hardware installed in these casement windows, and I think this cyberspace color really made these windows pop here inside the house. I could also finally get the masking material that comes applied to the window from the factory removed. And one thing to make sure to hang on to if you're building a house is this Energy Star certification sticker, which the inspector will check for during your final inspection. Once I had that sticker, I could remove the masking material, and it's amazing how much better these windows looked without it. I'd actually installed these LED accent lights a few months ago, so let's rewind back and see how those went in. I added one length of the channel to the trim and then started adding the LED strips, and these are the specific strips I used. I had run low voltage wire through the walls earlier in this tiny house project, which allowed me to connect this second strip to the first strip on the opposite side of the room, so both strips could run off of one power supply. Since these plywood walls were already finished, I could also go ahead and get the screwless outlet covers installed. And one tip when installing these types of covers is to loosen the screws which hold the outlet and switch to the box before installing the cover. And this will allow you to get the cover screwed tight to the outlet and switch, and then fine tune the mounting screws to get the plate flush with the wall. I repeated the process of installing light fixtures in the foyer hallway and above the kitchen sink, and then I could move on to the ceiling fans. And all of the fans can be controlled with the included remotes or via Wi-Fi, and I also opted for fans with built-in LED lighting. After getting the smaller blinds installed, I could finally move on to installing the massive shades for the big sliding door in the main room, and this was one of the reasons I was so excited to use these SmartWing shades, as they could be made large enough to cover this giant 16-foot wide opening. These larger blinds installed just like the rest of the blinds, except they had one extra bracket for added support, and once they were mounted, I could try them out, and as expected, they worked great. And these blinds, in addition to the sliding privacy doors I plan to build for the outside of the tiny house later on, should really give our guests some much needed privacy since these giant sliding doors face our main house. So with all that painting work, the lighting work, and getting those blinds installed checked off the list, I think the last thing to get this place livable is some furniture. And in this master bedroom, that's this IKEA PAX closet system, as well as this king bed that I built a few years back. I actually got the first of the IKEA PAX cabinets installed prior to installing the trim, so we could butt the trim into the cabinet. So I opted for a 39-inch wide PAX unit for the leftmost cabinet, as this would serve as the utility closet with the tankless water heater, and I added two 19-inch wide units to the right to serve as closet and dresser space in this master bedroom. With the PAX unit set up, I could wrap up the master bedroom by getting the live edge king bed I built a few years ago moved into the room, along with the Shushugiban side tables, which I also built. And with that, I could call the master bedroom ready for guests. Out in the main room, I got a TV and couch set up in the living room area, and then brought in the walnut bar stools, another old project, for the kitchen island. My plumbers also came out to plumb the tankless water heater and kitchen sink, so we officially had hot water in the tiny house. And with that, I could officially call the tiny house done enough for guests. All right guys, the weekend has come and gone. My parents stayed out here. Also my brother came out to surprise me and they loved their stay. They were raving about everything and that was a huge relief after doing all of that work to prep for them coming. Next I could get a Schluter strip installed where the drywall and plywood met up, and this is where the backsplash would end. I fastened the Schluter strip in place using roofing nails, and roofing nails are great for this application as they have an extremely flat head, so they wouldn't cause the tiles to kind of be pushed out in those spots. Anyway, once I had a handful of tiles pre-cut, I could get to installing them by first spreading a layer of thin set on the wall using a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch square notch trowel. Next, I added the first tile, working it into the thin set to make sure it adhered well to the wall, and also adding an 1/8 inch spacer below the tile to space it up off the countertop. And I just continued repeating that process down the first row, and once I had a few more tiles installed, I could start on the second row. After starting the fourth piece, I filled in the tiny corner piece around the outlet, and then I could continue on down the wall. And I had a few rip cuts to contend with here under the window, which were a little bit tricky, and so they definitely slowed things down a bit, but I got them installed and then unfortunately had to call it there for day one. So this work was all basically more of the same until I got to the light fixture on the wall, which I had to scribe around because it's a circle. Thankfully, this cut went really easy with the tile saw, and I could even back bevel the cut using the saw, which made fitting the tile to the light fixture super simple. I continued installing more tile and got the entire big wall wrapped up before lunchtime, which I thought was pretty awesome progress. I continued working on this shorter wall section after lunch and got the last tile installed by about 4 p.m., ending this run with another section of that same Schluter strip. Next, I got the grout applied to the wall, working it into the joints from multiple directions to make sure the joint was completely filled before scraping off the excess. By the time I finished applying the grout, the section where I started was set up enough to start wiping off any excess. And the grout had actually dried a little bit more than I wanted, so I had to work the joints a decent amount with the sponge to get them looking good, but luckily this grout is pretty forgiving. I also made sure to change the water in my grout bucket frequently, as this really helps to reduce any grout haze from forming later, and this is a mistake I've made a bunch in the past. I finished the grouting work completely soaked in sweat, and I always forget how physical this process is, but I think it turned out looking really good. I used a color-matched 100% silicone caulk, applying it and then tooling the joint with a caulk tool. And I sprayed the caulk down with more denatured alcohol before tooling the joint, and this helps keep the caulk from sticking to the caulk tool. I repeated the process on both walls and in the corner, which you also want to caulk instead of grouting. And with that done, I could call the tile work done, thankfully. Now that the tile was in, I could get the filler strip installed on the rightmost upper cabinet, and this required some pretty detailed fitting. So the gap between the cabinet and the wall was about 1/8 of an inch wider at the top of the cabinet, so I had to carefully lay out where to cut, and I cut this piece off camera with my table saw, because my table saw is all the way up in my garage, and I didn't feel like moving my camera. I also beveled the cut edge, which made adjusting the fit with a hand plane much easier. Once the fit was looking good, I needed to trim back the LED strip trim before installing the filler strip, and I had purposely left this piece long, and after marking where I needed to cut, I pulled out my V20 oscillating multi-tool to make the cut. And these tools are really worth their weight in gold on these kind of projects, as I really don't know how I would have made this cut otherwise. Once that was done, I could get the filler strip installed, first tacking it in place with my brad nailer. To attach the strip more securely, I pre-drilled and countersunk a few holes and added screws to permanently attach the filler strip. And as you can see, the filler strip really gives the cabinets a nice finished look and also hides that end of the tile run. The last thing left to do here in the kitchen was install the blind corner insert, which is made by Revishelf, and I got it through Rockler. This thing takes an otherwise fairly useless space and adds a ton of storage, and I really like this tray system versus your typical Lazy Susan. With that done, I got the faucet and sink light reinstalled and also installed the island chandelier. And with that done, I could officially call this kitchen project a wrap, finally.
So let's start with covering the process of painting the exterior of the tiny house. The first step was to get any dirt, spider webs, or other junk off of the siding and trim, and I used a pressure washer for this. I also went ahead and hit my gutters while I was at it, since this was a pretty good opportunity to get them cleaned up as well. After letting the water dry off, I came back and looked for any areas with missing caulk, dings, or any other issues. For example, this section of siding never got caulked when we originally installed the siding, so I went ahead and caulked between the end of the boards and the trim. I used an airless sprayer to paint the exterior of the tiny house, so before spraying, I needed to mask off all of my windows, doors, and outlet boxes. After getting everything loaded up, I could finally get to painting, and I started on one of the ends of the tiny house.
And one tip when painting the exterior of a house, you generally want to work from the top down, especially if you're using extension ladders leaning against the house, so you're not putting your ladders into wet paint. I was able to use a combination of ladders and a walkboard on the tiny house since it's not a super tall building, and this made things go a lot quicker since I could do the entire top half of the wall without moving the ladders. With the top half of this first section done, we moved the walkboard setup out of the way to the next section of the tiny house so I could finish the bottom half of the wall. And I repeated the process of spraying along the trim using the spray shield, and I also repeated the process along the bottom of the siding to keep from getting paint on the girders. When spraying, I tried to keep the gun a consistent distance from the wall, and I also overlapped each pass slightly to help blend each pass. I also angled the gun slightly upwards to make sure the paint worked its way under the bottom edge of the lap siding. We continued on along the center of the back of the tiny house, and I also went ahead and painted the electrical panels to match the rest of the wall so they'd blend in better. Once the center section was done, I could wrap up the back side of the house, and I should also mention that I painted the inside corner trim the same color as the siding, as it would have been basically impossible to keep this white without masking it all off. And this is how the inside corners are on our main house, so I went with that method here too. After lunch, we continued spraying, getting the other end of the tiny house sprayed, and then we finally moved to the front of the house. And I had saved the front for last, thinking I'd have really gotten the hang of everything by that point, but in reality, I'd also sweated my butt off in the summer sun and got a little sloppier as the day dragged on. Luckily, it was pretty easy to clean up any overspray on the trim with a wet paper towel, and I just continued on down the front of the house, spraying on more paint. As you can see, the big sliding door took up a huge chunk of this front wall, so that went super quick. And we finished up that last section at about 3 o'clock, which is insane considering I started spraying around 9:30 that morning. The next day, we got the masking material removed and everything was looking great except for a few spots of overspray on the trim. To deal with those areas, I pulled out a scraper tool, and this made quick work of removing the overspray from this PVC trim. To protect the floors during the painting process, I laid down ram board in any areas we'd be painting, and while this was pretty time consuming, it was really nice to have the floors well protected. I also went ahead and masked off the door hinges as I didn't feel like removing them again since I had just painted the door jambs a few weeks ago. With that done, I could get the trim painted, and I started with the trim since it meant I could paint more quickly without worrying about cutting in where the trim edges meet the wall, since the walls would need to be painted anyway. The next day, I got prepped to paint the walls, starting by removing any outlet covers or other things on the walls, like this ceiling fan remote. Next, I could get the trim taped off, and I used this awesome painter's tape applicator, which made taping this trim a breeze. And the applicator rolls out the tape in a perfectly straight line, and this was much quicker than trying to roll it out by hand. I also taped where the plywood ceilings and walls met up with the drywall, as I didn't want to have to spend a ton of time cleaning paint off of the plywood later. I first cut in around the edges using a brush, but in the future I'm also going to use a small roller around the edges, both for better coverage but also to match the texture of the larger roller. Once the edges and the areas around the outlets and switches were cut in, I came back and rolled on the first coat, which went super quick. I repeated the painting process in both bedrooms, the hallway, and the kitchen, and then I could let the first coat dry for a few hours. So unfortunately, as I mentioned, the areas where I cut in with the brush didn't have as good of coverage as the areas where I used the roller, and this basically forced me to do a second coat, which was definitely a bummer. Before adding the second coat, I sanded the walls with this large sanding pad, and this helps both with adhesion as well as making sure the walls have a nice, even texture. Once that was done, I repeated the process to put a second coat on the walls, and this went much quicker than the first coat. Finally, once the second coat was dry, I could go ahead and remove all of that tape and ram board, and this is always a pretty exciting moment since you get to see the final result of all your hard work. And one tip when removing tape after painting is to score where the tape meets the wall, as this helps to prevent the tape from peeling off the new paint. I continued removing the tape and ram board, and this took a surprising amount of time, but the results were great. And thankfully, I wrapped this up right as my parents rolled into town for another stay in the tiny house, and my dad could check out my work while I finished cleaning up. And with that done, I could call the painting process on the tiny house complete. All right guys, so it's been about 1.5 years since I finished the tiny house, and I realized I never really did a tour, so went ahead and grabbed some shots in and around the house just to show you guys how it all turned out. I think it turned out amazing. We had some landscaping done out front to really kind of tie in the space between our main house and the tiny house. I think that really made everything look nice and finished out there. And then obviously inside, I think looks incredible. I am really happy with the way the whole thing came together. I think it's a really well designed and laid out space. All of the guests we've had stay out here have really enjoyed their time. It's perfect for a couple or a family of 4. There's enough space without it being too big. Obviously we had some limitations placed on us by our HOA, but I think we ended up with a really cool space even with those limitations. So again, I do have plans available for the tiny house in case you want to build something similar to this. I'll link to that in the video description below. Also down there, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used on this project. If you haven't already, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And last, if you want to support me, I have merch available and I have both Patreon and YouTube members set up. All right, thanks for watching y'all, and until next week, happy building.